The telegram arrived on a Tuesday, which was the same day Victor Hale decided that Caleb Thorne had run out of time. It wasn't delivered politely. Two of Hale's men rode onto the property at dawn before the ranch hands had finished their coffee, and one of them nailed the paper to the front door of the house with a hunting knife. The blade went in deep enough that Caleb had to work it loose with both hands. He read the message standing on his own porch in the cold morning air, and what it said was this: "Sell the water rights by Friday, or we'll make sure you have nothing left worth selling. No signature." Hale never signed anything he might have to answer for later. Caleb folded the paper and put it in his shirt pocket. He went inside and poured himself the rest of the coffee. He stood at the window and looked out at the land his father had broken his back to hold. And he thought about a lot of things. The mortgage that was already tight, the two ranch hands who'd quietly quit last month without giving a reason, the way the creek had been running lower than usual, as if someone upstream had figured out how to slow it down. He thought about all of that. And then he thought about the letter he'd sent to the agency in St. Louis 3 weeks ago, the one where he'd described himself as a practical man looking for a practical arrangement, a woman who understood that frontier life was hard and that he wasn't offering comfort so much as a roof and a chance. He had not expected a reply so quickly. He had not expected, when the reply came, to feel anything at all reading it. He thought about that letter too, standing at the window with his cold coffee. Friday was 4 days away. The stagecoach was due Thursday. The coach from Cheyenne always came in loud. The driver, a heavy-set man named Pruitt, who had been making the run for 11 years, liked to announce his arrivals with the kind of noise that suggested he'd survived something worth celebrating. The crack of the whip, the grinding of the wheels on the packed dirt road into Red Hollow, the horses blowing hard after the last grade, all of it together made a sound the town had come to use as a clock. Caleb was standing near the depot with his hat in his hands when the coach rolled in. He wasn't sure what he'd expected. The letters had been brief, careful. Evelyn Hart wrote the way a person writes when they're not sure how much the other person actually wants to know. She'd described herself as a quick learner, willing to work, not afraid of cold weather. She hadn't described her appearance. He hadn't asked. It had seemed beside the point, and then the closer Thursday came, the more he'd wondered if he'd made a mistake treating it as beside the point. Pruitt hauled back on the reins and the coach lurched to a stop. The door swung open from inside before he'd even set the brake. The woman who stepped down first wasn't looking at Caleb. She was turned back toward the door of the coach, one hand extended, her attention entirely on something behind her. Then the child came out. She was small, 4 years old maybe, though she carried herself with the compressed wariness of a creature that had learned to take up as little space as possible. Dark hair pulled back from a thin face. A coat that was clean but too large for her, the sleeves turned up twice at the cuffs. She gripped the woman's hand the way a person grips a rope over water. Caleb stood still. The woman, Evelyn, finally turned around. She had brown hair and steady gray eyes and a face that looked like it had been through something and had come out the other side not exactly unscathed, but still functional. She scanned the small crowd at the depot, the way you scan a room when you're expecting trouble and hoping to be wrong about it. When her eyes landed on Caleb, he wasn't sure how she knew him, except that he was the only man there holding his hat in both hands like a fool. Something in her expression tightened. She looked at him. She looked at the child beside her. She looked back at him. Then she said quietly, the words carried to him on cold air, "I'm sorry. I know the letters didn't mention her. I couldn't leave her. If that means this doesn't work, I understand." The child hadn't looked up yet. She was staring at the ground beside Evelyn's boots. Behind Caleb, he could hear the murmur starting, the low, surprised noise of a small town encountering something it hadn't planned for. He could feel it without turning around. The depot agent's sharp intake of breath, the woman from the dry goods store who'd come to watch and now had something to actually talk about. The ranch hand he'd brought along, a young man named Dell, going very quiet in that particular way that meant he was trying not to have an opinion. Caleb looked at the little girl. He looked at her small hand wrapped around Evelyn's fingers, the knuckles pale with how hard she was holding on. He put his hat back on. "If you stay," he said, "she stays too." He hadn't planned to say it. He wasn't entirely sure, in the moment after it came out of his mouth, what had made him say it. The child still hadn't looked up. Evelyn was looking at him with an expression he couldn't fully read, something between relief and disbelief, like she'd been braced for a blow and the blow hadn't come, and she wasn't sure yet if it was a trick. "My name's Caleb Thorne," he said. "You must be hungry, both of you." That was how it started. The ride out to the ranch took the better part of an hour, and it was mostly quiet. Evelyn sat in the back of the wagon with the child pressed against her side, both of them watching the landscape open up around them. The pale winter grass, the long dark line of the ridge to the north, the sky that went on in every direction until it became something you couldn't exactly look at directly. Dell drove and kept his eyes on the road and didn't say a word, which Caleb appreciated. Caleb sat in the back too, which he was aware was slightly unusual, but the child had tracked every movement he made since they'd left the depot, and he figured putting distance between himself and them wasn't going to help anything. He stayed on the opposite side of the wagon bed and let the silence do its work. After a while, the girl, he'd heard Evelyn call her Maisie, just once, softly, when she'd settled the coat more firmly around her shoulders, turned her head and looked at him directly for the first time. She had very dark eyes. They were too serious for her age, which wasn't something Caleb could have explained precisely, but which he recognized all the same. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked away. He didn't say anything either. He figured they'd get there in time, or they wouldn't. The ranch came into view around the last curve of the road. The main house first, then the barn, then the cluster of smaller outbuildings. It wasn't much to look at in winter. The house needed paint on the south-facing side, and one of the fence posts along the drive had been leaning since September, and he hadn't gotten around to resetting it. Evelyn didn't say anything about any of that. She took it in, and then she said, "The creek I can hear, is that the one that runs along the east side of the property?" He looked at her. "You can hear it?" "I grew up near water," she said. "You learn to listen for it." It was an odd thing to say, and it struck him as true in a way he couldn't immediately account for. He said, "Yes, runs along the east pasture, feeds the south grazing land in spring." She nodded, like she was filing that away. "Does it run year-round?" "Every year I've been here." She nodded again. Her eyes moved over the outbuildings, the barn, the frozen ground of the yard. She wasn't looking at it like a woman examining her new home. She was looking at it the way a person looks at something they're trying to understand the value of. He didn't know what to make of that yet. The housekeeper, Margaret Cole, had been with the Thorne Ranch for 6 years, since the winter Caleb's father had the accident and someone had needed to hold the house together while Caleb held everything else. She was in her mid-50s, built like someone who had never wasted a movement in her life, and she had opinions the way other people had furniture, everywhere, load-bearing, and not easily moved. She was waiting in the kitchen when they came in, and she looked at Evelyn the way you look at a new tool that you're not sure is the right size for the job. Then she looked at Maisie. Something shifted in Margaret's face, not softening exactly, more like a very brief interruption in the standard expression. She looked at the child for 3 full seconds, and then she looked at Caleb, and her face settled back into its usual configuration. "I've put the east room together," she said. "Supper's on the stove." "Thank you, Margaret," Caleb said. Margaret looked at Evelyn. "You'll need warmer boots than those before the week's out." "Yes," Evelyn said. "I know. There's a spare pair in the mudroom, belonged to Caleb's mother. They might fit." Evelyn said, "Thank you." Margaret said nothing else. She went back to the stove. It wasn't warmth exactly, but it was something, and Caleb noted it. Maisie, still holding Evelyn's hand, looked at the kitchen. The iron stove, the long table with its uneven legs, the strings of dried herbs hanging from the ceiling beam, the window that looked out over the east yard. She looked at all of it with those 2 serious eyes. Then she looked at the stove and said, very quietly to no one in particular, "It smells like soup." Margaret, without turning around, said, "Because it is soup." A pause. "I like soup," Maisie said. "Good," said Margaret. "Sit down." That first night was harder than the day. After supper, which Maisie ate more of than Caleb would have expected from a child her size, and which she ate with the focused attention of someone who had recently been acquainted with not having enough. Evelyn put her down in the east room. Caleb could hear the low murmur of Evelyn's voice through the door, too soft to make out words, just the rhythm of it, steady and unhurried, until it stopped. When Evelyn came back down, she sat at the kitchen table and Caleb poured coffee because it was the only reasonable thing to do at 9 o'clock on a cold night, and they sat across from each other for a moment in the way of two people who have agreed to something significant and are only now beginning to understand the specifics of what they've agreed to. "She doesn't talk much," Evelyn said. "She used to, I think. Before." "Before what?" Evelyn wrapped both hands around the mug. "Her mother was my neighbor in St. Louis. We'd been neighbors for 3 years. She died in August, fever. Her husband had gone 2 years before that. There was no one else." "You took her in." "I said I would." She looked at the table. "I said it to a woman who was dying and who needed to hear it, and I meant it. And then I had to figure out what it meant in practical terms." "Which brought you here?" "Which brought me here." She looked up at him. "I should have said so in the letters. I know that. I was afraid you'd say no before I had a chance to explain." "I might have," he said honestly. "I don't know." She absorbed that. "Would you tell me what's happened with the telegram? The one you received Tuesday morning?" He went still. "How do you know about that?" "Dell mentioned it, at the depot. He said it to the other man, the one from the feed store. He didn't think I was listening." She looked at him steadily. "I was listening." Caleb set down his mug. He looked at her for a moment. Then he reached into his shirt pocket and put the folded paper on the table between them. She read it. She read it again. She put it back on the table and smoothed it flat with 2 fingers, a small, precise gesture. "Water rights," she said. "The creek that runs along the east pasture. Someone's figured out that it's sitting on top of a significant underground source. Rich man named Victor Hale has been buying up the land around here. The ranchers who sell are paid fairly. The ranchers who don't." He nodded at the telegram. "What happens to them?" "Fences get cut, stock wanders off, barn fires." He said it flatly because it was a flat kind of fact. One family, the Aldersons, had their well poisoned, lost most of their animals. "Did they sell?" "Yes." "And you haven't?" "No." Evelyn looked at the telegram again. "He's given you until Friday." "Yes." "Today is Thursday." "Yes." She sat with that for a moment. Outside, the wind was picking up. Caleb could hear it moving around the north side of the house, finding the loose board near the eave that he kept meaning to nail down. "What are you going to do?" she asked. "I'm going to hold on," he said. "I don't know what that looks like yet, but I'm going to hold on." She looked at him for a long moment. He expected another question. Instead, she picked up her coffee mug and said, "Then I'll do the same." He wasn't sure what he'd expected her to say. Not that. Bob. Friday came and went. Nothing happened. That was the first thing Caleb had learned about men like Victor Hale. The deadline was a theater. The real pressure came in the days after, quiet and cumulative, designed to make you feel the walls closing in without being able to point to exactly where the walls were. By Saturday morning, the post on the south fence line had been pulled out entirely. Not cut, but dug up, which took more effort and sent a different kind of message. By Sunday, one of the calves Caleb had been watching through a difficult birth was found dead near the creek. No obvious cause. The hands looked at each other and didn't say what they were thinking. Evelyn saw all of this. She didn't comment on it directly, and she didn't ask him to explain things he'd already explained. But she watched. She had a way of being present in a room or a yard or a barn without requiring attention, without inserting herself into what was happening. And yet Caleb kept noticing that she was always in a position to see what there was to see. She was also working, harder than he'd told her she needed to. The first morning, Margaret had given her a look when she appeared in the kitchen before the sun was fully up and asked where the washboard was. By the third morning, Margaret simply pointed at it without looking up from the stove, and that was as close to acceptance as Margaret Cole offered anyone inside the first month. The hands were less certain. There were 4 of them. Dell, who was 22 and generally tried to think well of people. Pete and Harlan, who were brothers and mostly thought in terms of whether a thing was useful or wasn't. And an older man named Roy, who had been working this land since Caleb's father ran it, and who had looked at Evelyn that first day with an expression that said, He was reserving judgment and wasn't sure he'd ever finish reserving it. "Word in town is she tricked you," Dell said to Caleb on Monday afternoon, the two of them mending the south fence line in the cold. He said it the way Dell said uncomfortable things, straight but without meanness, because Dell was constitutionally incapable of meanness, and it sometimes made him annoyingly honest. "Word in town doesn't know anything about it," Caleb said. "I'm just telling you what's being said." "I know what's being said. Hand me the wire stretcher." Dell handed it over. He was quiet for a moment. "The kid's something, though. Maisie." Caleb worked the wire without answering. "She talked to me this morning," Dell continued, "about the horses. She said she'd never seen one up close before. I let her give the roan an apple, and I thought she was going to—" He stopped. She cried a little, just a little, like she was trying not to let it show. Then she wiped her face on her sleeve and said thank you very formal, like a little old lady. Caleb set the wire stretcher down for a moment. "She wasn't crying because she was scared," Dell said. "I think she was just, I don't know, happy." "Don't tell Roy that," Caleb said. "Roy already knows," Dell said. "He's been leaving apple cores near the gate every morning, so she'll have something to feed them." Caleb picked up the wire stretcher again and didn't say anything, because there wasn't anything useful to say, and because something had just shifted slightly in his chest, and he wasn't ready to examine it. The first real trouble came on a Wednesday, 10 days after Evelyn and Maisie arrived. Caleb was out in the north pasture checking on the herd when he heard the riders coming up the main road. Not the subtle, quiet approach of someone who didn't want to be heard, but the deliberate, unhurried pace of men who had every intention of being seen. He counted 3 of them as he came back over the rise, cutting across the frozen field at a pace that was faster than he'd like to admit. They'd stopped in the yard. 2 of the men were still mounted. The third had dismounted and was talking to Evelyn, who had come out of the house at some point and was standing on the porch with her arms crossed. Caleb came into the yard at a walk. He had to make himself do that. Keep it to a walk. The man on the ground was someone Caleb recognized, a man called Briggs, who was employed by Victor Hale in a vague and flexible capacity that seemed to encompass everything from property management to whatever this was. He was in his 40s, lean and careful, with a measured quality about him that was more unsettling than outright aggression would have been. Maisie was not in the yard. Caleb noted that first. "Morning, Thorne," Briggs said without turning around from Evelyn. "Briggs?" Caleb moved to stand at the base of the porch steps, between Briggs and Evelyn. "Something I can help you with?" "Just a courtesy call," Briggs said. He smiled at Evelyn. "Mr. Hale asked me to welcome your new arrangement to the territory." "That's generous," Evelyn said. Her voice was entirely level. "Please tell Mr. Hale thank you." "He's also asked me to pass along a concern," Briggs said. "He's heard that conditions on this property have been challenging lately. Livestock losses, fence damage. He's a man of considerable resources, and he's concerned about the welfare of everyone living here, especially," he glanced toward the house, "the more vulnerable residents." Caleb felt something cold move through him. "That sounds like a threat," he said. "It sounds like concern," Briggs said pleasantly. "It sounds like a threat." Briggs looked at him for a moment. "Mr. Hale is a patient man, Thorne. He has a lot of patience, but patience isn't the same thing as unlimited patience." He looked back at Evelyn. "Think about what's worth holding on to. That's all he's asking." He tipped his hat. He got back on his horse. The 3 of them rode back out the way they'd come. The same unhurried pace, the same deliberate visibility. Caleb stood in the yard until they were out of sight. Then he turned around. Evelyn was still standing on the porch, arms still crossed, watching the road. Her face was controlled, but her knuckles were white against her upper arms. "He was looking at the house," she said. "Not at you, not at me. At the house, like he was measuring something." "He was." "Where's Maisie?" "In the kitchen with Margaret. She's fine." A pause. "I made her go inside when I heard the horses." He looked at her. "You did that on purpose. Came out yourself to keep them focused on you." Evelyn said nothing. "That wasn't smart," he said. "No," she agreed. "It wasn't." She uncrossed her arms.
But Maisie was in the kitchen, and Margaret was with her, and I didn't want them moving toward the house. She looked at him with those steady gray eyes. Is that what he does? Uses the people around you? It's what he does, Caleb said. She was quiet for a moment. Then we need to make sure there's nothing he can use.
He wasn't sure standing there in the cold yard if that was possible, but the way she said it, not as a wish but as a problem to be solved, made him feel something he hadn't felt in a long time. Not hope, exactly. Something more practical than hope. Something that felt like a plan. That night, after Maisie was asleep, Evelyn sat at the kitchen table with a piece of paper and a pencil and began making a list. Caleb sat across from her and watched her do it, which he was aware was slightly rude, but which she didn't seem to mind or notice. "What are you writing?" he asked. "Everything you've told me about Hale," she said, "and everything I've noticed since I got here." She wrote something, paused. "What's the creek called?" "It doesn't have a name. We just call it the East Creek." "When did Hale first approach you about the water rights?" "September, just over 4 months ago." "What exactly did he want to buy?" "The rights to the underground source. He knows there's water below the east pasture, significant amount of it. The creek is just the visible part." "What use does he have for an underground water source in Wyoming territory?" Caleb looked at her. "What?" She looked up from the paper. "He's a land baron. He's trying to acquire property. He could use water rights for farming, for ranching, for town development. Any of those are plausible. But he's after this specific source, on this specific property, harder than any of those explanations justify. He's been putting significant resources into forcing you out." She tapped the pencil against the paper. "Why this one? Why you?" Caleb hadn't thought about it in those terms. He'd been focused on holding the line, on the immediate pressure, on the fence posts and the dead calf and Briggs's smile. He'd been thinking about the what, not the why. "I don't know," he said. "Neither do I," she said. "But I think we should find out." Roy appeared in the kitchen doorway in his socks and his nightshirt, squinting in the lamplight. He looked at the two of them at the table with the paper and the pencil. He said without any particular expression, "Whatever you're plotting, do it quieter. I could hear you from the bunkhouse." "We're talking," Caleb said. "You're talking loud." Roy looked at Evelyn's list. "What's on the paper?" "Things I'm trying to understand," Evelyn said. Roy came fully into the kitchen. He pulled out a chair and sat down. He looked at the list for a moment. "The surveyors," he said. Caleb looked at him. "Last summer," Roy said. "June, maybe July, before Hale made his first approach. A team of surveyors came through, said they were working for the territorial government, mapping water sources. I didn't think much of it at the time, but they spent 2 days on this property, 2 full days, more than they spent anywhere else along the creek." Evelyn wrote that down. "Did they file a report?" she asked. "I don't know," Roy said, "but if they did, there'd be a record somewhere. Territorial Land Office, maybe." Caleb was looking at Roy. "Why didn't you mention this before?" Roy looked back at him with the particular expression of a man who has worked a piece of land longer than the man currently running it. "Because before, nobody was asking the right questions." Evelyn looked at the list. "Where's the Territorial Land Office?" "Cheyenne," Caleb said. "Can someone get there and back in 2 days?" "If they push it." She looked at him. He looked at her. He thought about the telegram. He thought about Briggs in the yard and the way the man's eyes had moved to the house, measuring. He thought about Maisie feeding the roan horse an apple through the fence and wiping her eyes on her sleeve and saying thank you like a small formal person. "I'll leave in the morning," he said. "Send Dell," Evelyn said. He blinked. "What?" "If you leave, Hale's men will know you've left. This property will be without its owner, and they'll use that. Send Dell. He's young. They won't watch him the same way, and you need to be here." He sat with that for a moment. "She's right," Roy said. Caleb looked at Roy. Roy shrugged with the elaborate nonchalance of a man who had decided something. "She's usually going to be right, I think. You might as well start getting used to it." Dell left before sunrise on Thursday. Caleb watched him go from the porch, the lamp unlit, the yard dark. He listened to the hoofbeats fade up the road and then disappear, and he stood there for a while in the cold, not thinking about anything in particular, just standing. He heard the door open behind him. Maisie came out in her nightgown and her too large coat and her boots that she'd put on the wrong feet in the dark, and she stood beside him and looked in the direction Dell had ridden. "Where did he go?" she asked. "Town," Caleb said. "He'll be back." She thought about this. "Is it because of the bad men?" He looked at her. "Where'd you hear about bad men?" "I heard you talking," she said. "Before. You said there were bad men." He should have been more careful. He made a note of that. "There are some people making things difficult," he said. "Dell's going to help sort that out." She looked up at him with those serious eyes. "Are you going to be okay?" It was the most direct thing she'd said to him since she'd arrived. He looked at her, this small, watchful child who had lost everything she'd known and come out the other side still capable of asking if other people were going to be okay. He said, "I'm going to do my best." She thought about that the way she thought about everything, thoroughly, without rushing it. Then she reached out and very carefully took hold of two of his fingers with her small hand. She didn't say anything else. She just stood there beside him in the cold and the dark, holding two of his fingers, watching the road where Dell had gone. Caleb stood still. He didn't move, and he didn't speak, because he was afraid that if he did either of those things, something was going to come loose that he'd been holding together for a very long time, and he wasn't sure he was ready for that. The sky in the east was just beginning to go the color of iron before dawn. The wind had died down overnight. Everything was very quiet. He stood there with his two fingers in the hand of a 4-year-old girl he hadn't known existed 2 weeks ago, and he thought, "This is the thing. This is the thing Victor Hale is going to try to use against me." And then, very quietly, under that thought, "Then I need to make sure there's nothing he can take." He didn't know yet what that was going to cost. He only knew that he had until spring to figure it out. Dell came back on Saturday afternoon, and he didn't come back alone. He rode in with a leather satchel strapped across his chest that he hadn't left with, and behind him was a woman Caleb didn't recognize. Older, 50s maybe, riding a gray mare with the ease of someone who'd spent considerable time on horseback. She wore a canvas coat and a no-nonsense expression, and she looked at the ranch with the same measuring attention Evelyn had shown when she'd first arrived, which made Caleb instinctively trust her slightly more than he might have otherwise. Dell dismounted in the yard and handed the satchel to Caleb before he'd even said hello. "The land office had records going back 8 years, Dell said. He was tired. 2 days of hard riding showed in the set of his shoulders and the dust on every visible surface of him. The survey team that came through last summer wasn't working for the territorial government. Caleb looked at the satchel. They were working for a railroad company, Dell said. A company that doesn't exist anymore. This dissolved last October, which is interesting timing. But before it dissolved, it filed 6 survey reports with the Territorial Land Office, and 5 of those reports were on property that Hale has since acquired. He paused to let that land. The 6th report is about this property, about the underground water source under the east pasture. A railroad, Caleb said. Not for drinking water, said the woman on the gray mare. She dismounted with the same unhurried efficiency she seemed to apply to everything. For steam. You run a rail line through this territory, you need water stations every 30 miles or so. An underground source this size, in this location. She looked at Caleb. It's worth considerably more to a railroad than it is to a rancher. Who are you? Caleb said. Clara Finch, she said. I'm a lawyer. I practice in Cheyenne. Your man came to the land office while I happened to be there on another matter, and we got to talking. She looked at him steadily. I've been watching Hale's land acquisitions for about a year. I've had 3 clients lose property to him in the last 8 months, and I haven't been able to prove anything because everything he does is just clean enough to hold up. She nodded at the satchel. But that survey record is a connection I didn't have before. Caleb looked at Dell. Dell said, I thought you should hear it from someone who knew what it meant. Caleb opened the satchel. Inside were copies of documents. Dell had clearly spent most of Friday in the land office, writing out every relevant record by hand. Survey reports, property transfer filings, a dissolution notice for the railroad company. The handwriting was Dell's, cramped and earnest and slightly uneven from the speed of it.
Evelyn had come out of the house during all this. She stood at the edge of the porch and took in the scene. Dell, the satchel, Clara Finch, the documents. She said nothing. She was reading the situation the way she read everything, quietly and from a slight distance, until she had enough of the shape of it. "Come inside," Caleb said. "Both of you."
They spread the documents across the kitchen table. Margaret brought coffee without being asked and then stayed, which was the most significant indication of the seriousness of the moment. Margaret never stayed for anything she considered peripheral. Clara Finch looked at the papers in a particular way, organizing them by some internal logic she didn't explain, moving this one to the left and that one under another, and pulling two of them aside to lay flat. Caleb watched her do it, and had the sensation of watching someone read a language he'd only just learned existed. "Here's the problem," Clara said, not looking up. "The survey record proves that the company working for Hale, and it was working for Hale, the connection is thin, but it's there, identified the value of this water source before Hale made his first approach to you. That establishes intent. It suggests his whole operation in this valley has been designed around acquiring this specific resource." She tapped one of the pages. "But survey records and a dissolved company aren't enough on their own. I need a direct link between Hale and the railroad, and I need evidence of how he's been forcing people out." "The Aldersons," Roy said from the doorway. He'd been leaning there for the last 10 minutes. "Their well was poisoned. They could testify to that. Did they report it to anyone at the time?" "Sheriff Crane," Roy said, with a tone that answered the follow-up question before it was asked. Claire's expression didn't change, but something in it acknowledged what Roy wasn't saying. "Crane is on Hale's payroll?" "Can't prove it," Caleb said. "But he's never managed to do anything useful about any complaint involving Hale's operation." Clara wrote something in a small notebook. "I'll need to work around Crane. There's a territorial marshal's office in Laramie that operates independently of the county. If I can build enough of a case, I can take it there directly." She looked around the table. "What else do you have? Anything written? Any records of Hale's people coming onto this property? Any damage? Any correspondence?" Evelyn put her hand on the table and slid a folded piece of paper toward Clara Finch. Clara looked at it. She unfolded it. She read it. "This is the telegram. From Tuesday of last week," Evelyn said. "Caleb kept it." Caleb hadn't entirely remembered keeping it. He'd put it in his pocket and it had stayed there because he hadn't thought to take it out, which wasn't the same thing as a deliberate decision to preserve evidence, but the result was the same. "This is useful," Clara said. "It's not signed, but the content is threatening and the timing fits the pattern." She looked at Caleb. "I want to be honest with you. What I have right now is suggestive, not conclusive. Hale has lawyers, good ones, men who've been trained specifically to create just enough legal distance between him and everything he does. Building a case that will hold is going to take time." "How much time?" Caleb said. "I don't know. Months, possibly." The kitchen was quiet for a moment. "He's already burned one barn in this valley," Roy said. "He poisoned the Aldersons' well. How many months does another family have?" Clara looked at Roy directly. "That's the question, isn't it?" She said it without softening it, which Caleb found he respected. "I don't have a good answer. What I have is this. The more documentation you can create from this point forward, the stronger the case becomes. Write down every incident. Date, time, description, witnesses. Every fence cut, every animal found dead, every visit from men like Briggs. Keep the record somewhere safe." She paused. "And don't give him a reason to escalate." "He doesn't need a reason," Evelyn said. Everyone looked at her. She was looking at the table, at the spread of documents. "Men like Hale, the reason isn't the point. The reason is an excuse. He'll escalate when it's useful to him, regardless of what we do or don't do. The question is whether we can be ready for it when it comes." Clara Finch looked at Evelyn for a moment with an expression that was, briefly, something close to approval. "That's accurate," she said. "What?" Dell slept for 14 hours straight after supper. Caleb let him. Clara Finch stayed the night in the East Room. Evelyn and Maisie had moved to the smaller room off the kitchen without being asked, which had required rearranging Margaret's careful domestic order, which Margaret had managed with the pained efficiency of someone relocating furniture she hadn't agreed to move. By morning, Clara was back at the kitchen table before the coffee was ready, working through the documents again. She left after breakfast with the copies in her own saddlebag and a list of names Caleb had given her. The Aldersons, two other families he knew had sold under pressure, a ranch hand from the Kemper property who'd been let go after refusing to cooperate with one of Hale's men. She shook Caleb's hand at the gate, and then she shook Evelyn's hand, and she said to Evelyn, "Keep writing things down." "I will," Evelyn said. They watched her ride out. The morning was cold and bright, the kind of winter day that looked warmer than it was. "She seems like she knows what she's doing," Dell said from behind them. "She does," Evelyn said. "Is it going to be enough?" Neither Caleb nor Evelyn answered, which was its own kind of answer, and Dell accepted it with the philosophical resignation of a 22-year-old who was slowly learning that most important questions didn't have satisfying responses. 3 weeks passed. January settled over the ranch with the full weight of a Wyoming winter, and life contracted to the essentials, keeping the animals alive, keeping the pipes from freezing, keeping wood on every fire. Maisie, who had never experienced cold like this, adapted with the pragmatic resourcefulness of a child who had already proven she could adapt to harder things than weather. She wore 2 pairs of socks and Margaret's old scarf wound twice around her head, and she stopped complaining about the cold after the first week, which Margaret noted with a brief nod that served, from Margaret, as high praise. She also started talking more. Not all at once. It was more of a slow thaw, like the difference between the creek in January and the creek in March. A comment here, a question there, and then one afternoon in the barn where Roy was teaching her the names of every piece of tack hanging on the wall, she produced an uninterrupted stream of conversation that lasted 40 minutes and covered horses, the color of the sky when it was about to snow, whether chickens could tell time, and a detailed account of a cat she had once seen in St. Louis that had 3 different colors and was, in her assessment, the most beautiful animal she had ever encountered up until the roan horse, which she wanted to be clear had now taken that position. Roy listened to all of this with the gravity of a man in a very important meeting. He answered every question as though it merited serious consideration. He told her the chicken question was one he'd been wondering about himself. When Caleb came into the barn and found the two of them deep in a discussion about whether horses preferred apples or carrots, he stood at the door for a moment without announcing himself. Roy caught his eye over Maisie's head. Something passed between them, not words, nothing that would survive being said out loud. Just an acknowledgement of the fact that the barn had a different quality to it than it had in December. More air in it somehow. More light. Caleb went back outside without interrupting. "Mom." The trouble when it came again announced itself quietly. Pete came in one evening near the end of January with his jaw set in the particular way that meant he'd seen something he didn't like. Caleb was in the main room going over the account books, a task he found deeply unpleasant and put off longer than he should, when Pete knocked on the doorframe and said, "Riders on the ridge." Caleb looked up. "How many?" "3 I could see, maybe more." "Just watching?" "Just watching." It was legal, technically. The ridge was public land. Men could sit on horses on public land for as long as they cared to. It meant nothing that could be proved and everything that needed to be understood. "Note it down," Caleb said. "Date, time, how many, how long." Pete nodded and left. Caleb went back to the account books, but the numbers had stopped making sense to him, and after a few minutes he closed the ledger and sat in the quiet. He heard footsteps on the stairs. Light ones, then heavier ones right after, which meant Maisie first and Evelyn following. He heard the low sound of Evelyn's voice and Maisie's higher response, and then the sound of the kitchen, the clatter of a cup being set on a table. He'd grown familiar with those sounds in a way he hadn't noticed happening, the way you don't notice it getting dark until the room is already dim. He got up and went to the kitchen. Maisie was sitting at the table with a cup of warm milk, which she was holding in both hands the way she held most things, with complete, focused attention, as though the cup might be planning to go somewhere without her. Evelyn was at the stove. She glanced at him when he came in and read something in his face and turned fully around. "What happened?" "Nothing yet. Riders on the ridge." She absorbed that. "How long were they there?" "I don't know. Pete saw them going on dark." She turned back to the stove, filled a second cup, and put it on the table. It wasn't an invitation so much as a fact. There was coffee, there was a cup. He could sit if he wanted. He sat. Maisie looked at him. "Are the bad men back?" "There were some men on the hill," he said. "That's all." She looked at him with those eyes that saw more than was comfortable. "You're worried." "I'm being careful," he said. "Those aren't the same thing." She thought about that. Then, "Roy says being careful is what keeps people safe." Roy's right. Roy said you're the most careful man he knows. Caleb looked across the table at Evelyn, who was looking at her coffee with an expression that was carefully not a smile. "Roy talks too much," Caleb said. "Roy says that too," Maisie said cheerfully. The riders were on this ridge again the next 2 nights. Caleb documented each instance, the time, the duration, the number visible. He sent the records to Clara Finch in Cheyenne with a note that was 3 lines long and said nothing that couldn't be said plainly. Clara wrote back in a week with a letter that said she'd found one of the ranch hands from the Kemper property and that he was willing to speak to the marshal's office about what he'd witnessed. She also said she was looking into the railroad connection through a different channel. A land speculator in Denver who'd had dealings with the dissolved company and might have records worth examining. It was progress. It was also very slow, and the slowness had its own particular pressure, the pressure of waiting for something you couldn't see coming and couldn't exactly prepare for. Harlan got jumped on the road back from town in early February. 3 men, faces covered. They didn't rob him. They took nothing. They just beat him badly enough that he came home unable to sit a horse comfortably for a week. And they told him, before they left, that men who worked for people who didn't cooperate with Mr. Hale's reasonable business arrangements tended to have continued difficulties. Harlan told Caleb this lying on his bunk with his face already swelling, and he said it in the flat, contained voice of a man who was mostly angry, but had decided to make the anger useful rather than let it spill. Caleb sat beside him for a while. He didn't say anything useful because there wasn't anything useful to say. He said he was sorry it had happened. He meant it. "You're not going to sell," Harlan said. It wasn't a question. "No," Caleb said. "Good," said Harlan. He closed his eyes. "Because if you do, I'm going to be very annoyed, and I'm not in a good position for that right now." Caleb documented the assault. He sent it to Clara. He rode over to the Alderson property and told them what had happened, and Mr. Alderson listened with the expression of a man hearing something he'd been expecting to hear and hating that he'd been right. "He'll go further," Alderson said. "I know." "My wife wants me to tell you something." Alderson looked at him steadily. "We shouldn't have sold. We know that. But we had the children to think about, and we—" He stopped, cleared his throat. "What I mean to say is, if it comes to it, if there's a way we can help, we'll do it." Caleb looked at him. "We still know what we saw," Alderson said. "We still know what happened to our well. That hasn't gone anywhere." He paused. "And whatever your woman did, coming out here with a child and standing up to Briggs in your yard the way I heard she did, you tell her we said there are people in this valley who noticed that." Caleb said, "I'll tell her." He did. That night, after Maisie was asleep, he sat across from Evelyn at the kitchen table and repeated what Alderson had said, almost word for word, because it seemed like the kind of thing that should be delivered accurately. Evelyn listened. When he finished, she looked at the table for a moment. "He didn't have to say that," she said. "No." She was quiet. He could see her working through something. Not the information itself, but what it meant, the shape of it. Finally, she said, "This is what Hale doesn't understand." "What?" "He thinks the pressure only runs one direction. He thinks he can keep making things harder until people break." She looked up. "But every time he pushes, he makes another person angry. And angry people with something to prove are less useful to him than frightened people, because frightened people just want it to stop. Angry people start looking for ways to fight back." Caleb sat with that. "He's building us a case," she said. "He doesn't know that, but he is." It was the first time in weeks that Caleb had felt anything that resembled a solid footing. He didn't entirely trust it. Solid ground in winter had a way of turning unreliable. But he held on to the idea the same way you hold onto the rail on an icy porch, enough to keep your balance. What neither of them could have known that night was that Hale already knew he was losing the slow war, and that men who know they're losing the slow war tend to stop fighting slowly. February turned to March. The worst of the cold began to loosen. Not warmth exactly, but the absence of the most brutal cold, and the ranch moved into the particular exhausted busyness of late winter, when the animals needed more attention because the ground was still frozen, but the bodies were starting to remember what moving freely felt like. Maisie had learned to muck out a stall. This had been Roy's doing. He'd started her small, just carrying the bucket, and then one day she'd picked up the small rake without being asked and done a respectable job of it, and Roy had looked at the result and said, which in Roy's register was equivalent to a standing ovation. She was also learning to read. Evelyn worked with her every evening. A worn primer that had come in the bottom of Evelyn's traveling bag, along with a change of clothes and a bone-handled hairbrush, and a photograph of a woman Caleb had never asked about. Maisie approached reading the way she approached most things, with intense seriousness and absolute refusal to be defeated by difficulty. And she was making progress that Evelyn reported to Caleb with a quiet, precise pride that she didn't seem to know she was displaying. It was a life, not an easy one, not a graceful one, but an actual accumulating daily life, which was something different from what Caleb had been living before, the functional isolation of a man maintaining a property and calling it an existence. He noticed this slowly, in the way you notice most true things, only after they've been true for some time. What he also noticed, and tried to be careful about, and wasn't always successful, was Evelyn herself. The way she moved through the ranch with an increasing competence that was neither performed nor announced. The way she'd taken over the mending without ever discussing it, not because she was expected to, but because she'd looked at the pile of it in the corner of the workroom and apparently decided it was a problem that could be solved. The way she talked to Margaret, which was the most revealing thing of all, not with the careful politeness of a woman trying to be liked, but with the blunt functional directness of two people who had agreed, without discussing it, to make the same household work. Margaret had, in the course of 6 weeks, moved from tolerating Evelyn's presence to a state of wary but genuine respect that she expressed by occasionally telling Evelyn things she hadn't asked to know. Small pieces of information about the ranch's workings and histories, offered without ceremony and clearly not to be repeated. Caleb was aware that this was significant. He was also aware that he was thinking about Evelyn more than was strictly necessary for the practical management of a working ranch. He didn't do anything about this. He wasn't sure yet what there was to do. They had an arrangement, a sensible, practical arrangement that had been entered into under unusual circumstances, and that both of them were navigating with more honesty than he'd expected. He didn't want to complicate that with something he couldn't name clearly. But the evenings were long and the kitchen was warm and she was there. He kept that observation to himself and went back to the account books. The letter from Clara Finch arrived on a Tuesday in the first week of March, and it changed everything. She had found the railroad connection. Not thin anymore, solid. Through the land speculator in Denver, she'd traced the dissolved company back to a holding entity that was directly registered to two of Hale's known business partners. She had a signed affidavit from the Kemper Ranch hand. She had the Aldersons' willingness to testify about the well. She had the survey records, the property transfers, the telegram. She wanted to file with the Territorial Marshal's office in Laramie within the week. But she also wrote, in the last paragraph, something that turned the initial relief of the letter into something more complicated. I must be direct with you. Hale will know this is coming, or suspect it. Men in his position have their own networks of information, and the process of building this case has involved speaking to enough people that I cannot guarantee its secrecy. My concern is that once he perceives the case being built against him, his behavior may change significantly. He has shown patience as a strategy because patience has been working. Take it away, and you may find a different kind of man underneath. Please be thoughtful about your circumstances over the coming weeks. Caleb read that paragraph twice. He handed the letter to Evelyn. She read it once, set it on the table, and looked at the window. He's going to move before she can file, she said. That's what she thinks. She's right. Evelyn's voice was level. Not frightened, not angry. Concentrated, the way a person concentrates when they are deciding something. What does he want most? The water rights. What's the fastest way to get them? Force a sale, or... He stopped. Or get me to sign something under duress, Evelyn said.
She said it plainly without flinching at what it implied. I'm the easier target. You won't sell. Everyone knows that. But a frightened mail-order bride. She picked up the letter again. He still thinks I'm that, doesn't he? Caleb was looking at her. He's had people watching this ranch for weeks, she said, and he still thinks he sees a woman who came here with nowhere else to go, who's in over her head, who would sign whatever document you put in front of her if you scared her badly enough. She set the letter down. He's going to use that. I won't let him get close enough. You can't be everywhere, she said. Not unkindly. You know that. He knew it. He'd known it since January, since the riders on the ridge, since Harlan came home with his face swollen shut. The property was too large, the winter had thinned the hand's capacity, and Hale had more men and more patience than any one person could outmaneuver on their own. We need to tell Clara to move faster, Evelyn said. She's already moving as fast. Faster, Evelyn said. And we need to write to every rancher in this valley who has a reason to want Hale stopped. The Aldersons, yes, but who else? Whose fence lines are next to ours? Who's lost stock? Who's had the riders on their ridges too? Caleb thought. The Morrisons. The Garfield operation, though they're further east. Old Warren Polk, who's too stubborn to sell but doesn't have enough hands to, write to them, she said. Tonight. Tell them what Clara has. Tell them it's close. She looked at him with those steady gray eyes that had been the first thing he'd noticed about her, standing at the depot with a child clinging to her hand and her shoulders set like a woman prepared to be turned away. Don't ask them to do anything yet. Just make sure they know the shape of it. People fight differently when they know they're not fighting alone. He looked at her for a long moment. You've been thinking about this, he said. I've been thinking about this since the night I read the telegram, she said. Since before that, actually. Since the day Briggs came into the yard and looked at the house. Outside, the March wind had come up, rattling the loose board near the eave, the one he still hadn't nailed down, which he was beginning to think of as a measure of how fully his attention had been claimed by other things. He'd get to it. He'd get to a lot of things, on the other side of whatever was coming. He said, I'll write the letters tonight. She said, I'll help. Margaret appeared in the doorway with fresh coffee, looked at the two of them and the letter on the table between them, and set the pot down without comment. She went back to the other room. Through the wall, they heard the precise, contained sound of Margaret Cole doing something useful, which was the only sound she ever made, and which was in its own way a form of solidarity. Caleb pulled a fresh sheet of paper toward him. He picked up the pen. He looked at the blank page and thought about what you say to a man who has lost something to ask him to risk something more, and how you say it in a way that sounds honest rather than desperate, because desperate men made poor allies and honest men made better ones. Then Evelyn put her hand on the table, not on his hand, just near it, and said, Start with the Aldersons. You said they were ready. He started with the Aldersons. The lamp burned low. The wind worked at the loose board. Somewhere above them, Maisie slept in the small room off the kitchen, and outside the east pasture lay frozen over the underground water that a man in a fine coat in Cheyenne had decided was worth taking by force. And around the valley, the other ranchers slept in their cold houses, not yet knowing that the shape of things was about to change. Caleb wrote 5 letters that night. Evelyn sealed each one while the ink dried on the next. They didn't talk much. There wasn't much that needed saying. The work was the thing, and they did it, side by side in the quiet of a kitchen that had become, without either of them quite deciding it, the center of something larger than a single man's determination to hold on to his land. The letters went out on Wednesday. By Friday, 3 responses had come back. Warren Polk's was the shortest. 4 lines, written in the shaky hand of a man in his 70s who had survived more Wyoming winters than most people would attempt. I've been waiting for someone to start this fight properly. Tell me what you need and when. The Morrisons sent a longer letter, cautious but committed, listing the specific incidents they'd documented over the past 4 months with a precision that suggested they'd been keeping records already, quietly, without knowing anyone else was doing the same. The 3rd letter was from a rancher named Gus Farley, whose property sat at the northern edge of the valley, and it said simply, Hale's men cut my water line 2 weeks ago. I didn't tell anyone because I didn't think anyone would care. I care now.
Caleb read all 3 letters at the kitchen table and then passed them to Evelyn without comment. She read them and passed them to Roy, who read them standing up, the way Roy read everything, as though sitting down might give the words too much advantage. 6 families, Roy said when he'd finished. If the Garfields come in, 7. That's enough to bring to the marshal's office, Caleb said. Claire said she needed collective weight, names and documented incidents from multiple properties. Then send them to her. I'm going to, tonight. He looked at Roy. I need you to ride to the Garfield place tomorrow. Don't send a letter. Go yourself. Tell them everything. I need to know by Monday if they're in. Roy nodded. He put the letters on the table and picked up his coffee. He looked out the window at the yard, at the fence line, at the ridge beyond it that had been occupied by Hale's watchers 3 nights in the past 2 weeks. They haven't been on the ridge in 4 days, Roy said. I know. That bother you? Yes, Caleb said. Roy nodded again, like this confirmed something he'd been thinking. Men stop watching when they've already decided what they're going to do. The kitchen was quiet. Outside, the March wind had shifted to come from the south, which meant warmer air was moving in. The ground would start to soften by the end of the week, and with it would come all the particular vulnerabilities of the thaw, the mud that pulled at wagon wheels and the swollen creek that tested every low fence line. Winter had its difficulties, but it also had a certain legibility. The thaw was harder to read. I'll go to the Garfields, Roy said, and left. Maisie found the creek that Saturday. Not in any alarming way. She'd been in the east yard helping Dell move feed sacks, which mostly meant following Dell and carrying things that were too light to be real work, but which he gave her anyway because she liked having a job. And she drifted naturally toward the sound of the water, which was running faster now that the ice was breaking up. Dell had gone back to the barn for another handcart, and she'd simply kept walking. Evelyn found her 20 minutes later, crouched at the bank with her boots dangerously close to the mud and her face about 6 inches from the surface of the water, watching something with her full concentration. Maisie? There's a fish, Maisie said, without looking up. Evelyn came to the bank and stood behind her. There was, in fact, a small dark shape holding itself in the current just below a submerged rock, too cold to be moving fast, just maintaining its position against the flow with small, steady adjustments of its tail. It's very small, Evelyn said. It's doing work, though, Maisie said. It has to keep swimming, or it moves backwards. Evelyn looked at the fish. She looked at the back of Maisie's head, the dark hair escaping from its braid. Come away from the edge, she said. The bank's soft. Maisie stood and stepped back, but her eyes stayed on the water. Does this creek go all the way through the ranch? Through the east pasture and south, yes. Roy says there's water underground too, under where we're standing. That's what the surveyors found. Maisie considered this with the gravity she applied to most things. Is that why the bad man wants it? Evelyn was quiet for a moment. She had not lied to Maisie about what was happening. She'd told her there were problems with the ranch, that adults were working to fix them, that it was not her worry to carry. But Maisie had a way of collecting information from the edges of conversations and assembling it quietly into understanding, and there was no point pretending she hadn't. Yes, Evelyn said. That's why. Is he going to get it? No, Evelyn said. Maisie looked at her. You sound sure. I am. She wasn't entirely. She was close to sure, which was a different thing, but close enough that it came out as sure, and she decided that was all right. Some things you said the way you wanted them to be true, and the saying of it helped make them so. Good, said Maisie. She looked back at the water. I don't want to leave. It was the most direct thing she'd said about it. Evelyn stood very still. I know, she said. This is the first place I've wanted to stay, Maisie said, with the uncomplicated plainness of a child who had not yet learned to dress important things in smaller words. She paused. Is it okay to say that? Yes, Evelyn said. It's okay to say that. Maisie nodded, satisfied. She watched the water a moment more, then looked up at Evelyn with those serious eyes. Does Caleb want us to stay? Evelyn held her breath for a half second. I think so, she said. Maisie seemed to weigh this. Roy says he does. Roy says a lot of things. Roy's usually right, though, said Maisie, and walked back toward the barn. Evelyn stood at the creek bank a moment longer, looking at the water moving south over the submerged rocks, listening to the particular sound it made where it bent around the bank. And she thought about the fish holding its position against the current, doing its small, invisible work. And she thought, yes, that's exactly right. That's the only way to do it. She walked back to the house. The barn fire happened on a Tuesday night, 12 days after Caleb's letters went out. Not the main barn. The equipment shed to the north, which held the smaller tools and 2 of the wagons. Dell saw it first from the bunkhouse window and shouted, and everyone came running, and they got enough water on it fast enough that the structure survived with heavy damage to one wall and the loss of a wagon and a significant collection of tools that would take money they didn't have to replace. Nobody was hurt. That fact sat alongside the other facts and had to be weighed against them. Caleb walked through the damaged shed at 2 a.m. with a lantern, Dell beside him. The smell of burnt wood was dense, in particular, the kind of smell that stays in your hair and your clothes and makes the night feel smaller. Accelerant, Dell said. He pointed to the pattern of burn along the base of the north wall. Started here. Went up fast. Yes. There'll be tracks in the mud. From the thaw. I know. In the morning. Dell was quiet for a moment. He looked at the ruined wall, the blackened ceiling beams. This is what he did to the Kemper barn, before the Kempers sold. I know that too. Caleb raised the lantern and looked at the space where the wagon had been, the warped metal of what remained, the twisted handles of tools fused together by heat. He thought about the cost of replacing them, the timing of it, the way it would pull resources away from spring work that couldn't wait. He thought about how precisely Hale had calculated this, not enough to destroy, just enough to drain. He documented it. He stood in that burned shed at 2 a.m. and wrote down everything he saw in his own notebook, with the date and time, and a description of the accelerant pattern, because Clara Finch had said to write everything down, and he was going to keep that instruction even at 2 a.m. in the smoke. He found the tracks in the daylight. 2 horses, coming from the north road, stopping at the shed, leaving the way they'd come. Roy cast his eye over them and said 2 men, moving fast, confident they wouldn't be seen. Caleb copied the track pattern in his notebook as precisely as he could, measured the stride length, noted the direction. Then he went inside and added it to the report he was building for Clara. What he didn't do was ride to confront Hale directly, though there were several hours that day where he stood in the yard and thought about it with more seriousness than was useful. Roy seemed to know this was happening without being told, because Roy appeared at his elbow at the relevant moments with something that needed doing and steered him back toward it without ever acknowledging what he was steering him away from. Evelyn saw it too. She didn't say anything about it until evening, until after Maisie was asleep and the house had settled into its nighttime quiet, and then she said, "Going after him directly hands him exactly what he wants." "I know that," Caleb said. "Knowing it and feeling it are different." "I know that too." She sat across from him, both of them at the table that had become the place where every serious conversation happened. She had a cup of tea going cold in front of her, and she was looking at it without seeing it. "Clara needs another week," she said. "Maybe less. The marshal's office has already been in contact," she wrote yesterday. "They're ready to receive the full filing. She just needs the Garfield statement." Roy brought it back Monday. "Then it's almost done." She looked up at him. "He burned that shed to make you move, to make you do something he can respond to, something he can use. Don't give him that." Caleb was quiet for a long moment. "It's going to get worse before Clara can file," he said. "Yes." "He's not going to stop at a shed." "No," she said. "He's not." They looked at each other. It was the honest conversation underneath the honest conversation, the one where neither of them pretended that patience was anything but difficult, that waiting was anything but its own form of cost. "What worries you most?" he asked. He asked it because he realized he'd been not asking it, circling it, and that was not being careful. That was being afraid of what she'd say. She was quiet for a moment. Maisie, she said, she wanders. She doesn't mean to, she's just curious and she forgets to tell anyone where she's going. I've talked to her about it, but she's 4 and she forgets. She paused. I've been keeping closer watch, but if something were to happen, if Hale decided he wanted real leverage and not just property damage. She didn't finish the sentence. Caleb said, from now on, she doesn't go to the east yard or the creek without one of us. I've already told her. Tell Dell, too. Tell Roy. Already done. She looked at her tea. I don't want her afraid. She was afraid for a long time before she came here. I don't want that for her again. No, he said, but I also can't pretend the situation isn't what it is. No, he said again. It was a line that most people never had to walk so consciously. The line between keeping a child safe and keeping a child whole, because those were not always the same instruction, and the space between them was where real judgment lived. He trusted Evelyn's judgment. He realized this sitting at the table, not as a surprise exactly, more as a recognition of something that had been true for a while. He wasn't ready to say that out loud. He wasn't sure she was ready to hear it. He said, get some sleep, and she said, you too. And they both knew they wouldn't, not entirely, but it was the right thing to say at the end of a long day. Maisie disappeared on a Thursday afternoon, 12 days before Clara filed. It happened the way Evelyn had said it would, which was the worst kind of happening, predictable in its shape, but devastating in the fact of it. The morning had been calm, Caleb out in the south pasture with Pete checking the new fence line, Dell repairing the shed damage, Roy not yet back from an errand to the Morrison place. Margaret was in the house. Evelyn had been with Maisie in the east yard, had gone inside for 20 minutes to see to something on the stove, had come back out and found the east yard empty. She went to the barn first, then the bunkhouse, then back to the house, every room. Then she called out, clearly and without panic, because panic did not help locate children. She called Maisie's name in the direction of the creek, of the north field, of the equipment shed. Nothing. Margaret saw her face when she came back to the kitchen doorway and said, in a voice stripped of everything except the fact itself, I'll ring the bell. The bell brought Dell from the shed and Pete from the south field and Caleb from further away than anyone would have liked, at a run that he tried to convert to a walk before he came into the yard so as not to frighten anyone, and failed. Evelyn met him at the gate. East Creek, she said. She was there last Saturday. She knows the path. How long? 30 minutes, maybe 35. Caleb looked at Dell. North along the creek. Go. Dell went, already running. To Pete. South field and the polk boundary. Pete went. Caleb said to Evelyn, the far side of the creek, through the cottonwoods. She mentioned it once, said she wanted to see where the water went. I'll go? No, you stay here in case she comes back. Caleb, if she comes back and nobody's here, she'll be frightened, he said, and the logic of it stopped her, though she hated it. Stay by the bell, 10 minutes if I haven't, ring it twice. He went. The cottonwoods on the far side of the East Creek were the place where the bank rose slightly and flattened into a small meadow that was barely visible from the main property, sheltered by the trees and by the bend in the creek. Caleb had played there himself as a boy, which was how he knew the path a curious 4-year-old who'd been watching the creek all winter might want to take. He found her there, but not alone. 2 men were standing in the meadow, not close to her. They were 10 feet back, positioned between her and the direction of home, which could have been accidental, but wasn't. Maisie was standing very still in the way she went still when she was frightened, that compressed, take-up-no-space stillness that was one of the worst things to see in a child. One of the men Caleb didn't know. The other was Briggs. Briggs turned when he heard Caleb come through the cottonwoods. His face was arranged in the pleasant professional expression he always wore, the one that made every conversation feel like a business meeting where the outcome had already been decided. Thorne, he said. We were just... Step away from her, Caleb said. His voice came out flat and very quiet, which was the opposite of how he'd intended it to sound, and which was, he would think later, probably more effective than if he'd shouted. Briggs took a deliberate step to the side, not back. The difference mattered and was meant to. Maisie said, Caleb, in a voice so small he almost didn't hear it. He crossed the meadow to her in about 4 steps. He put himself between her and the two men, and he felt her hand grab the back of his coat the way she'd grabbed Evelyn's hand at the depot, and the pressure of those small fingers on the fabric went through him like something electric. "She wandered off the property," Briggs said pleasantly. "We were only making sure she was safe." "You're on my property," Caleb said. "The creek marks the boundary." "She came to us," Briggs said. "We couldn't very well leave a child alone out here." "You're leaving now," Caleb said. Briggs looked at him for a moment with those measured eyes. Then he looked at Maisie, who had pressed herself against the back of Caleb's legs and was very still, and something moved behind his expression. Not guilt, nothing as complicated as that. More like a man reassessing the value of a piece on a board. "Mr. Hale would like to speak with you," Briggs said. "This week, if possible, before things get further along than they need to. I've said everything to Hale I have to say. He feels there may be room for a conversation that—" "Get off my land," Caleb said. A long pause. Briggs nodded very slightly. He looked once more at Maisie, and that look, that single quick look, was the thing Caleb would carry with him for a long time. The most honest thing Briggs had done in any of their encounters, because it wasn't threatening, it was merely noting, taking inventory. The two men walked back through the cottonwoods in the direction of the north road. Caleb stood still until he couldn't hear them anymore. Then he turned around. Maisie was looking up at him. Her face was pale and her eyes were very bright, and she still had her fist wrapped in his coat. "I'm sorry," she said. "I forgot." "I know." He crouched down to her level. Up close he could see that she'd been crying a little. Not much. Just enough that the edges of her eyes were wet. "Are you hurt?" "No." She shook her head quickly. "They didn't touch me. They just stood there, and I didn't know how to get past them." "You didn't do anything wrong," he said. "They were the problem, not you." Her mouth pressed together. "They were scary." "Yes. You weren't scared, though." He looked at her. He thought about what honest was, and what useful was, and whether they had to be different things. "I was a little scared," he said. "I just had somewhere to be and no time to be scared in." She absorbed this. Then she let go of his coat and put her arms around his neck, which was not something she'd done before, not exactly. She'd held his fingers, she'd leaned against Evelyn, she'd accepted Roy's arm steadying her on a horse. But this was different. This was both arms, full commitment, her face pressed against his shoulder. He put his arms around her. He stayed there in the meadow, in the cold, holding a 4-year-old who had been frightened by men doing their employer's work. And he felt something clarify inside him with the particular finality of a decision that has been waiting to be made. Evelyn was at the east gate when he came through the cottonwoods with Maisie on his hip. She took the child from him in one motion and held her, and Maisie let herself be held, and Evelyn stood there with her eyes closed for a moment, and her face pressed to the top of Maisie's head, and she didn't say anything at all. Caleb stood back. After a moment, Evelyn opened her eyes and looked at him over Maisie's shoulder. The question was in her face. "Briggs," he said, "and another man I didn't recognize. They were on the meadow side of the creek." Her expression tightened. "Did he—" "She's not hurt." He paused. "They didn't touch her. They were just there. That was the whole point." Evelyn understood that. He could see her understanding it, what it meant. That Hale had graduated from property damage to a different kind of message, one delivered in the presence of a child, one that required no physical harm to communicate exactly what was being communicated. That evening, she sent her own letter to Clara Finch. Caleb didn't read it before she sealed it. He asked her later what she'd written, and she said, "I told her what happened, exactly what happened. Times, names, what they said, what they didn't say. And I told her we need the marshal before Hale decides that being visible isn't enough. She's already moving." "She needs to know it's urgent," Evelyn said. "She's a lawyer, Shimba. She understands arguments. But sometimes you have to tell people which argument is the most important one right now." She was right. She usually was. About this kind of thing, and Caleb had stopped being surprised by it and started simply factoring it in. What he also factored in, after Maisie was asleep that night, and the house was quiet and he sat alone at the kitchen table, was the image of Briggs looking at the child. That small, careful inventory. That noting. He had underestimated what Hale was willing to do. He wasn't going to make that mistake again. Roy came back the next morning with the Garfield statement and news that Gus Farley had ridden to the Morrison property, and between the three families they'd documented 11 separate incidents in the last 2 months alone. Roy delivered this information in his usual manner, sitting down, coffee in hand, voice at the same flat pitch he used for all facts regardless of their weight. And then he looked at Caleb and said, "You look like you didn't sleep." "I didn't," Caleb said. "Thought so." Roy drank his coffee. The Garfields want to know if there's something they can do, not write down and send to a lawyer, actually do, their words. "Tell them to stay on their land and stay together and keep documenting," Caleb said. "That is doing something. Clara needs the record intact." Roy said he'd tell them. Del came in from the yard with mud on his boots and an expression on his face that meant he'd seen something. He stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at Caleb. "Riders on the North Road," he said. "Different from before. Not Hale's usual men." Caleb stood up. "There's a woman with them," Del said. "Riding in front. Gray mare." Caleb looked at Roy. Roy looked back at him with the calm of a man who has been expecting something to arrive and is now watching it arrive. Clara Finch rode into the yard 20 minutes later with 2 men behind her, one of them in a coat that identified him, to anyone who knew what they were looking at, as an officer of the Territorial Marshal's Service. The other Caleb didn't know. He met her at the gate. She dismounted without ceremony and looked at him with that direct expression she had, the one that didn't waste time on pleasantries when there was a reason not to. "I got Evelyn's letter," she said, "and I got something else yesterday morning that changed my timeline." She reached into the saddlebag and withdrew a folded document. "The railroad company that dissolved last October? One of its former directors filed for personal bankruptcy 3 weeks ago in Denver. His creditor filings list the Hale water acquisition as a business asset he was owed a share of." She held the document out. Hale's name, the railroad scheme, and the properties acquired under duress, all connected, in writing, filed in a federal court. Caleb took the document. He read the first paragraph. "Is it enough?" he said. "Combined with everything else, yes." She looked at the house, at the yard, at the property around them. "The marshal is here to take statements. Today, if your people are available. I want everything filed by the end of the week." Caleb thought about Maisie in that meadow. He thought about Briggs's careful look. He thought about the burned shed wall and Harlan's swollen face and the Aldersons' poisoned well and Warren Polk's 4-line letter and Gus Farley saying I didn't think anyone would care. "They're available," he said. He turned back to the house and raised his voice just enough to carry to the kitchen window, where he knew without looking that Evelyn was watching. "Claire's here," he called. "Bring the records." The window opened. A moment later, the kitchen door opened, and Evelyn came out with the bound notebook she'd been keeping since January. Every incident, every date, every name, written in her precise and careful hand, the daily record of everything Hale had done and everything they'd held on to in spite of it. She crossed the yard and put it in Clara Finch's hands. Clara opened it. She turned the first few pages with the expression of a lawyer who has been looking for something for a long time and has just found it. "This," she said, "is very good work." Evelyn said, "Write it down. That's all it is." "That's everything," Clara said. She closed the notebook and held it carefully. "Let's go inside." They went inside, all of them. Clara and the marshal and the man Caleb didn't know, who turned out to be a court clerk from Laramie who had ridden 2 days to be here, who sat at the kitchen table where so many important things had happened and opened his own notebook and waited. Margaret brought coffee for everyone without being asked, and then she sat down too, which she had never done in the presence of guests, and no one said anything about it because she had been a witness to more of this than almost anyone, and her staying was right. Caleb sat at the head of the table. He looked around it. Clara, the marshal, the clerk, Roy, Evelyn, Margaret. Del came in from the yard and stood in the doorway, which was as formal as Del got. Outside, through the kitchen window, the east pasture lay in the March light, the creek visible at the far edge, the cottonwoods beyond it. The marshal uncapped his own pen and looked at Caleb. "Start from the beginning," he said. Caleb started from the beginning. He talked for a long time. When he was done, Evelyn talked. Then Roy. Then Margaret, who spoke in the same precise economical sentences she used for everything, and who turned out to have noticed and remembered things that no one had known she'd noticed, because that was Margaret Cole. She saw everything, and she told you when it mattered and not before. By the time they finished, the light through the kitchen window had shifted from morning to afternoon. Maisie had come down at some point and been given warm milk and a piece of bread by Margaret, and had sat quietly at the far end of the table, not understanding most of what was said, but understanding that it was important and that the people she trusted were in the room, and that the room was full of the particular serious energy of something being fixed. She ate her bread and watched. The marshal collected the statements, and Clara collected the notebook, and the clerk sealed everything carefully into a leather case. "End of the week," Clara said to Caleb at the door. "Possibly sooner. Once this is filed, Hale's people will know. There's no way to prevent that. He may try something in the window between filing and enforcement." "I know," Caleb said. "Is there somewhere the child can go? Somewhere safer?" "She stays here," Evelyn said from behind him. Her voice was level. "We don't send her away. We keep her close." Clara looked at her. Then she nodded. "All right. Then keep her very close." She mounted the gray mare. The marshal and the clerk mounted their horses. They rode out of the yard and down the north road the way they'd come. And Caleb stood at the gate watching until they were out of sight, and then he stood there a moment longer. He heard Maisie come up behind him. She stood at his side and looked down the road. "Are they going to fix it?" she asked. "They're going to try," he said. She thought about this. "Are we going to help?" He looked down at her. Her face was turned toward the road, serious and watchful, a child who had already learned that fixing things required everyone in the room to stay in the room. "Yes," he said. "We are." She nodded, satisfied, and went back inside. Caleb stayed at the gate a moment longer. The afternoon light was long and pale across the pasture. The creek made its sound in the distance, constant and indifferent to everything that happened around it, moving south the way it always had, over the underground water that a man in a fine coat had decided was worth taking by force. Not yet, Caleb thought. Not this time. He went inside. Clara had said the end of the week. She filed on Thursday. Caleb didn't know this until Friday morning, when a rider came from town with a note in Clara's handwriting that said, "Filed yesterday afternoon. Marshal's office has the full case. Enforcement proceedings begin Monday. Hold on." 2 words at the end. Hold on. He read it at the kitchen table and then set it face down and finished his coffee before he told anyone, because he needed 60 seconds to sit with the particular feeling of something you've been working toward for months suddenly being real, and he didn't want to mistake that feeling for safety. It wasn't safety. Claire had told him that clearly. The window between filing and enforcement was exactly the window Hale would use. He turned the note over and read it again. Then he called everyone in. Roy came from the barn. Dell and Pete came from the yard. Harlan, whose ribs had healed enough to work but who still moved carefully on cold mornings, came from the equipment shed. Margaret appeared in the kitchen doorway. Evelyn was already at the table. He told them what the note said. The room was quiet for a moment. Then Dell said, "So it's done?" "The filing is done," Caleb said. "What happens next depends on how Hale responds to knowing it's done." "He'll already know," Roy said, "or he will by tonight. Men like that have someone in every office." "I know." "Then we've got maybe 12 hours before he decides what to do about it." "That's my estimate too." Caleb looked around the room. "Nobody leaves this property alone starting now. You go anywhere, you take someone with you. The animals are checked in pairs. I don't want anyone out after dark." Pete said, "What about Sheriff Crane?" "Crane can't touch a marshal's filing. He's county. The marshal's office is territorial. Different authority entirely. That's part of why Clara took it there." Caleb paused. "But Crane can still make things uncomfortable if Hale asks him to, so we don't go looking for his help, and we don't give him anything to work with." Harlan said, "And Hale himself?" Caleb looked at him. "He's not going to come here himself. Men like Hale don't come themselves." "He might," Evelyn said. Everyone looked at her. She was looking at the table, working through something. "He might this time. Not to negotiate, Kate. He knows negotiation is finished. But if he thinks he can get to me directly, get a signature on a property document before Monday, He'd see that as cutting the case off at the root. She looked up. Clara's filing documents what he's done. But if I sign over water rights voluntarily, it becomes significantly more complicated to argue coercion. The kitchen was very quiet. He doesn't know you, Caleb said. No, she said. He still thinks he does, though. And that's useful. He looked at her for a long moment, not sure he liked where this was going. She didn't offer where it was going. She just looked back at him with those gray eyes and waited. Nobody signs anything, Caleb said finally. Nobody talks to Hale or his people without someone else present. And nobody... He looked at Maisie, who had come downstairs at some point and was sitting at the far end of the table with her bowl of oatmeal going cold. Nobody goes anywhere outside this house alone. That includes you, he said to Maisie. Maisie looked at him with great seriousness. I know, she said. I already said I know. Say it again. I know, she said again, patiently, in the tone of someone who understood that some things needed to be said more than once, and that this was one of them. Ichum. The blizzard started Friday evening. It came from the northwest with very little warning. The sky had been overcast all day, but March in Wyoming was always overcast, and the temperature had been rising with the thaw, and nobody's body had remembered yet that rising temperatures before a storm were a warning rather than a relief. By the time the first real wind hit, the yard was already disappearing behind a wall of driven snow, and Caleb was outside pulling the barn door shut against it. Dell appeared from the direction of the bunkhouse, bent almost double against the wind. Horses are in, he shouted. Roy's got the south door. Caleb waved him toward the house. They went in through the kitchen door, snow coming with them, and Margaret shut it against the weight of the wind without saying anything about the snow on the floor. The storm closed down the world to the perimeter of the house and barn. The windows went white. The sound of the wind was constant and total, the kind of sound that makes every other sound feel tentative. By 8 o'clock, it was clear no one was going anywhere until morning, which meant Hale's people weren't going anywhere either. Caleb let himself think that for exactly as long as it was useful, which was not very long, because men who had made it to Hale's position in life generally did not let weather make their decisions for them. And the road from wherever Hale was staying, Cheyenne, or possibly the hotel in the town south of Red Hollow, was not impassable. Difficult, but not impassable. He told Roy this. Roy was sitting by the front window with a cup of coffee and a view of nothing but white. I know, Roy said. I've been thinking the same thing. Keep watching. I am. Maisie fell asleep on the settee in the main room somewhere around 9, wrapped in the quilt that lived there and had lived there since before Caleb's memory, with her arm over her face the way she slept when the wind was loud. Evelyn sat beside her for a while, then went to the kitchen. Caleb found her there at 10 o'clock, standing at the window that looked out over the east yard, which was completely invisible. Come away from there, he said. You can't see anything. I know. She didn't move. I'm thinking. About what? About what I'd do, she said, if I were Hale. He came to stand beside her. Outside, the snow came sideways. And? I'd wait until the storm peaked, she said, until it was hardest to move, hardest to see who was coming. Then I'd send 2 men, not Briggs, someone colder than Briggs, to this house. Not to hurt anyone, just to get me alone with the document and enough time to convince me that signing was the only way the child in the other room was going to be fine. Caleb was quiet for a moment. You've thought about this a lot, he said. Since Thursday, she said. Since before Clara filed, I've been trying to think like he thinks. She finally turned from the window. He's underestimated me every step of the way because he saw a mail-order bride who arrived with a child nobody wanted, and he put me in a category, and he's kept me there. She paused. I want to use that. Evelyn, if his men come here tonight, she said carefully, and they find you gone, drawn away by something, some distraction they've arranged, and they find me alone with Maisie, they'll feel they have the advantage. She looked at him steadily. And they'll talk. They'll explain what they want and why I should give it to them. And while they're doing that, I'll be listening to every word. I'm not leaving this house. Not for long, she said. If something pulls you to the barn, a horse in trouble, a fire, anything that sounds real enough, And Roy goes with you because Roy always goes with you? She paused. Pete can stay in the house. Harlan. They don't have to be visible. He looked at her. He was aware of the specific discomfort of understanding that someone else's plan was better than your instinct, which was to stay in this room with both hands on everything that mattered and not let anything near it. It's a risk, he said. Everything has been a risk, she said. Since January. If something goes wrong. I have been making decisions about risk since before I got on that stagecoach, she said, not angrily, just clearly. I knew what I was carrying when I came here. I knew what I was asking you to take on. I haven't been wrong yet about what I can handle. He looked at her for a long moment. She was right. That was the unambiguous fact of it. She had been right more consistently than he had, and he knew it, and she knew it, and the only question was whether his instinct to protect outweighed his judgment, and he was trying to make sure it didn't. Pete and Harlan in the back room, he said finally, within earshot. The moment anything moves towards something you can't control, you find a reason to knock something heavy off the kitchen shelf. She almost smiled. A pot. A pot, he agreed. That's the signal. She turned back to the window. They'll come after midnight, when the storm's at its worst. How do you know? Because that's when I would come, she said. They came at 1:30 in the morning, not through the front, through the mudroom door on the north side of the house, which was the door that was never locked because it was the door the hands used when they came in from the cold, and because whoever had come to unlock it had done so sometime in the previous hours while the storm gave them cover. Caleb was in the barn. He'd gone there 20 minutes earlier because Roy had come to the kitchen door with snow in his eyebrows and said in a low voice that one of the horses was showing signs of colic, which was plausible enough in storm weather that Caleb had pulled on his coat and gone. Pete and Harlan had already moved to the back room. Margaret was in her room off the kitchen, which she'd been asked to stay in, and which she had agreed to with the expression of a woman who did not enjoy being managed, but understood the necessity. Maisie was asleep on the settee. Evelyn was at the kitchen table with a lamp and a book she wasn't reading when the mudroom door opened. There were two of them. Not Briggs. Caleb had been right about that. Hale had sent a different category of man for this particular errand. The first was large and quiet, with the patient economy of someone who'd done this kind of work before. The second was younger, nervous in the specific way of someone who needed this to go smoothly for reasons of his own. Evelyn looked up from the book. She did not reach for anything. She did not stand. She sat at the kitchen table with the lamp between her and the door, and she looked at the two men and waited, which was exactly as unsettling to them as she'd expected it to be, because frightened women stood up and backed against walls, and that was the kind of scene these men had prepared for. The large one said, "Mrs. Thorne." "I'm not Mrs. Thorne," she said. "We haven't been to the magistrate yet." A small pause. He hadn't expected her to correct the name. "Miss Hart." "What can I do for you?" she said, as though they'd come to the front door at a reasonable hour. He pulled a chair from the table and sat down without being invited, which was also meant to be unsettling. He put a folded document on the table between them. "Mr. Hale would like to resolve the current situation before it becomes something that hurts people who don't need to be hurt." Evelyn looked at the document but didn't touch it. "What is it?" "A transfer of water rights, standard document. You sign it, Mr. Hale withdraws his interest in this property, and everything that's been going on." He spread his hands. "Stops." "Caleb Thorne owns this property," she said. "My signature doesn't transfer anything." "Mr. Thorne's signature is already on it," the man said, "witnessed and dated." Evelyn looked at the document. She knew, with the part of her mind that had been running contingencies since Thursday, that this was a forgery, that Caleb had not signed anything, that this was the specific lie Hale had chosen because it was the lie most likely to make a frightened woman believe she was the last obstacle and that resistance was pointless. She let herself look at the document for 5 full seconds. "That's his signature," she said slowly, as though she was persuading herself. "Yes," the man said. "Why would he sign this?" "Because Mr. Hale made him understand the alternative," the man said. He said it gently, which was more alarming than if he'd said it hard. Mr. Thorne is a practical man. He's made a practical decision. He just needs your signature alongside his to make it complete. And if I don't sign? The younger man shifted his weight near the mudroom door. The large man looked at her with patient, professional eyes. There's a child asleep in the next room, he said. We'd all prefer she sleep through the night without being disturbed. It was the threat that had been waiting underneath every conversation since January, finally said plainly. Evelyn had known it was coming. She had prepared for it, had practiced in her mind how she would receive it, had told herself she would stay level. It was still hard to hear. She felt her hands want to move under the table, felt the cold wash of it through her chest, and she took the feeling and she put it somewhere behind the part of her mind that was still working. I'll need to read it, she said. Of course. She reached for the document. She unfolded it. She began to read. She read slowly. The large man waited. The younger man near the door was trying to look at the window, at the wall, at anything except the moment he was standing in. Outside, the wind hammered at the north side of the house with a sound like something trying to get in. Evelyn turned the first page. She read the second page. She reached the third page and found, halfway down, what she'd been looking for. A clause, written in the dense language of property law, that did not merely transfer water rights but established a permanent easement across the entire east pasture, which would effectively bisect the ranch, which meant that what looked like a water rights transfer was actually the legal mechanism for Hale to run a rail spur across the property without further negotiation. She read it again to be sure. Then she looked up at the large man. This isn't just water rights, she said. A pause. It's a standard easement. This is a rail easement, she said, across the east pasture. This gives Hale the right to build a rail line through this property in perpetuity. She set the document on the table. This is the actual thing he's wanted since the beginning. The large man's face changed very slightly, just enough. Sign the document, he said, and the gentleness was mostly gone now. No, Evelyn said. A silence. From the main room, Maisie said in the voice of someone who has just woken up and is not entirely sure where she is, Evelyn? The younger man took a step toward the main room door. Evelyn stood up from the table and she knocked the cast iron pot off the shelf above the stove with her elbow as she rose, and it hit the floor with the largest sound a pot has ever made in a kitchen, a sound that went through the whole house, and she said in a clear and carrying voice, Stay where you are, Maisie. Don't come in here. Pete came through the back door fast, and Harlan came through right behind him, and the younger man near the main room door found himself stopped before he'd taken his second step, and the large man at the table stood up and looked at the situation with the expression of a professional recalculating his position. Evelyn picked up the document from the table and held it. This is the third piece of evidence tonight, she said to the large man. Her voice was steady. Your entry through a locked door without permission, a forged signature on a property document, and a rail easement clause in a document presented as a simple water rights transfer. She looked at him. Clara Finch is going to find all of this very useful. The large man said nothing. You should leave, she said. He left. Both of them left, back through the mudroom door, and Pete went after them to the yard to make sure they were going and not repositioning, and Harlan stayed in the kitchen doorway and looked at Evelyn standing by the overturned pot with the document in her hand. And he said, with the careful admiration of a man who knows he's seen something, that was something. Get Caleb, she said. He came from the barn at a run when Pete reached him, and he came through the kitchen door with snow on his coat and his face set in a way that she'd seen before, but not quite this concentrated, and he stopped in the middle of the kitchen and looked at her. She was still standing. The pot was still on the floor. She was holding the document. You're all right, he said. Not a question. Yes. Maisie? She's fine. She didn't come in. He crossed the kitchen and she held out the document and he took it and read it. Not slowly. He was not a man who read slowly when he was angry. And she watched his face as he reached the easement clause, watched the thing that moved through it. The signature's forged, she said. I knew it was when he put it in front of me, but I read the whole thing to find the clause. Caleb looked at the document. He looked at the forged signature bearing his name. They came in through the mudroom. The door had been unlocked earlier, before the storm. He looked up at her. They were in this house before tonight. Yes. He set the document carefully on the table. He put it face up, precisely aligned, as though the precision of placing it mattered, which maybe it did, because it was the kind of thing you did when you were keeping yourself from doing other things. Roy, he said, to the room. Roy appeared from the back room. He'd apparently followed Caleb in from the barn without Caleb noticing. Get this document to Clara Finch tonight, Caleb said. Right now, storm or not. Roy picked up the document. He looked at Evelyn. You all right? Yes, she said. Go. Roy went. Maisie appeared in the kitchen doorway in her quilt. She looked at Evelyn, at Caleb, at the pot on the floor. She looked at all of it with those serious eyes. Did the bad men come? She said. Caleb went to her and crouched down. They did, he said, and Evelyn handled it. Maisie looked across the room at Evelyn with an expression that was complicated for a 4-year-old. Relief and something else, something that looked like the specific pride of a child in the person they have chosen to attach themselves to. I knew she would, Maisie said. Caleb looked at the floor for a moment. When he looked up, his expression was something that Evelyn had not seen from him before. Not gratitude exactly, not relief exactly, something that was its own category and that she did not have a clean word for. Come on, he said to Maisie. Back to the settee. He carried her into the main room. Evelyn stayed in the kitchen and picked up the pot and put it back on the shelf. She put the lamp on the table. She sat down and put her hands flat on the table surface, and she let herself be for a moment, just a person in a kitchen after a long night, hands shaking slightly, which she hadn't permitted them to do while the men were in the room. She let them shake now. A minute, maybe less. Then she folded them together, and it stopped. And Roy made it to Clara Finch by Saturday morning. Clara had not slept, or had not slept much, which was evident in the note she sent back with Roy by midday Saturday. A note that was 3 times longer than her usual communications, dense with legal notation, and which ended with, "The forged signature and the easement clause are exactly the kind of direct evidence the marshal's office has needed to move from investigation to arrest. You have given us what we needed. Monday is no longer the timeline. I will contact the marshal today." Caleb read it standing at the kitchen table. He passed it to Evelyn. She read it and passed it to Roy. Roy read it, set it down, and said, which in Roy's register was approximately equivalent to throwing his hat in the air. The storm had exhausted itself by Saturday afternoon, leaving the world white and quiet and rearranged. The south fence had 2 posts down from the wind. The equipment shed had lost a piece of roofing. The east yard was drifted to the windowsill of the bunkhouse, which Dell had noted with a kind of aesthetic appreciation for the scale of it before going to find a shovel. They spent Saturday digging out. All of them, even Maisie, who was given the smallest shovel from the equipment shed and assigned a section of the path between the house and the barn that she attacked with the full intensity of someone who had been sitting still through a storm and was done with that. Caleb worked beside her for a while. She didn't talk much. She was concentrating, but after a bit she stopped and looked up at him. "Is it over?" she said. "Getting there," he said. She went back to her shovel, then, "Roy says when it's over, we can plant something in the east yard, in spring." "Roy says a lot of things," Caleb said. "He says you used to have a kitchen garden before your mother died and you didn't keep it up." Caleb looked at the east yard, at the snow over the ground that would soften in another few weeks. "She grew tomatoes," he said, "and those big sunflowers that got too tall." Maisie considered this. "I want to plant sunflowers." "They get too tall," he said. "I want the ones that get too tall," she said, with the serene inflexibility of a person who knows exactly what she wants. He looked at her. He thought about the meadow, and the 2 fingers she'd taken hold of in the dark before dawn, and the way she'd put her arms around his neck in the cottonwoods, and all the small daily accumulations of a child becoming attached to a place. "We'll plant sunflowers," he said. The marshal's deputies came to Hale's leased office in the county seat on Sunday morning. Caleb knew this because Clara sent word, and because by Sunday afternoon the news was moving through Red Hollow the way news moves through a small town, not in a straight line but in every direction at once, arriving differently at different places, some of it accurate and some of it not, but all of it carrying the same essential fact. Victor Hale had been taken in for questioning by the Territorial Marshal's Service. His files had been seized, and Briggs had been seen leaving the county on a horse moving at significant speed. The families who'd been waiting heard it by Sunday evening. Warren Polk sent a note that said only, "Good." 2 words, same as Clara's, but in a completely different key. The Aldersons came in person on Monday morning, arriving in the yard before breakfast. Mrs. Alderson with a covered dish, and Mr. Alderson with an expression on his face that was the expression of a man who has been carrying something heavy for a long time and has just been told he can set it down. He shook Caleb's hand without saying much. He nodded at Evelyn with something that was close to reverence. "We heard," he said, "what you did Friday night." "Word travels fast," Evelyn said. "It does in this valley." He looked at her steadily. "I want you to know what you and Caleb have done here, holding on, building the case the way you did. Those of us who didn't hold on." He stopped, cleared his throat. "We're glad somebody did." Evelyn said, "You're the ones who said yes when we needed you. That's not nothing." Mrs. Alderson said from beside her husband, "We'd like to help with the fence posts if you'll let us. Eli and my brother can come this week." Margaret, behind Evelyn in the doorway, said, "They can stay for lunch." This was, from Margaret, the equivalent of a town celebration. By Monday afternoon, Gus Farley had sent a note that his water line had been restored. Whoever had been interfering with it had apparently stopped the interference, which was its own form of information about how quickly Hale's operation was unwinding. The Morrison brothers rode through to say they'd seen Hale's hired men pulling out of the north pasture where they'd been camped for 2 weeks. Pete confirmed this from the ridge. It had the quality of a pressure releasing, not dramatic, not sudden, more like a long-held breath being let out, the kind of breath you don't realize you've been holding until you feel your chest move again. But Clara had told Caleb not to confuse Hale's absence with Hale's defeat, and Caleb held that. Hale had money and lawyers and the specific resilience of men who had escaped consequences before. The case was solid. Clara believed it was solid, but solid and finished were different things. He kept the records. He kept documenting, though there was less to document now. He wrote to Clara every few days. She wrote back. The case was moving. It was going to take months to reach a resolution in the courts. Property fraud cases always did. But the Marshal's hold on Hale's business operations had effectively stopped the acquisitions, stopped the intimidation, and the dissolved railroad company's creditor filings were creating a separate legal problem for Hale that would compound his difficulties considerably. Caleb read Clara's letters at the kitchen table as he'd read everything else there. The table had become the place where the shape of things was worked out, where Dell had handed him the satchel from Cheyenne, where he and Evelyn had written 5 letters in one night, where the forged document had been set face up with careful precision, where Maisie ate her oatmeal in the mornings and said things that were both simple and true. He was sitting there one afternoon in the last week of March, reading Clara's latest, when Evelyn came in from the east yard with mud on her boots, and her hair coming loose from its braid, and her hands dirty from where she'd been turning the soil in the corner of the east yard where the kitchen garden used to be. She stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at him. "Good news?" she said, nodding at the letter. "Good progress," he said. "Same as last week, a little further along." She came in and washed her hands at the basin. "Maisie wants to start seeds inside," she said. "She says Roy told her you can start seeds inside in March and put them out in May." "Roy's right," Caleb said. "Roy usually is." She dried her hands and looked at the window, at the yard outside, at the patch of turned earth in the corner that hadn't been touched in years. "She's very determined about the sunflowers." "So she told me," he said. Evelyn looked at him. He was looking at the letter. She stood at the counter, and she looked at him the way she sometimes did when she thought he wasn't paying attention. Not with any particular agenda, just looking, the way you look at something that has become part of your landscape, part of what the day looks like. He looked up. She looked away, at the window, at the yard. "I keep thinking," she said, "about what this place looked like when I got off that stagecoach. What did it look like?" "Like it was being held together by one person," she said, by someone who was very committed to it not falling apart, but who didn't have enough hands. She paused. I'm not sure what I thought, that I'd come to be useful. That was the right framing for it. Useful. And now? She was quiet for a moment. Now I think I came home, she said. She said it simply, without drama, the way she said true things. I know we haven't spoken about what this is, formally, what we are to each other. I know there are things still unsettled. She looked at the table rather than at him, but that's what it feels like. And I thought you should know that. The kitchen was quiet. The March light came through the window at the long, pale angle it had in late afternoon. Caleb set the letter on the table. He looked at it for a moment, not reading it, just looking. I sent a letter to the magistrate in Cheyenne, he said. Last week. She looked up. Asking what the process is, he said. For the formal part. She looked at him. He looked back at her. Neither of them said anything for a moment. Outside, they could hear Maisie in the east yard talking to Roy, who was presumably answering with his usual grave attentiveness. The words weren't clear through the window, just the rhythm of them. A child's high voice, an old man's low response, back and forth, easy. Okay, Evelyn said. Okay, he said. It wasn't a romantic moment by any conventional measure. He was holding a lawyer's letter, and she had dirt on her cuffs, and Maisie was outside discussing seed starting schedules with a man who had decided, sometime in the last 3 months, that these two people were going to stay, and that the ranch was better for it, and that the kitchen garden should come back, and that some things you knew before you were asked. But it was true, and it was theirs, and in a year that had held as much difficulty as this one, true and theirs was enough, more than enough. The afternoon light held. Outside, Maisie laughed at something Roy said. A clear, uncomplicated sound that came through the window and filled the kitchen. Caleb folded the letter and put it in his shirt pocket. He would send it to Clara in the morning. The magistrate's letter came back in the second week of April. It was a short letter, formal and procedural, explaining what was required. 2 witnesses, a signed declaration of intent from both parties, the magistrate's presence, or that of an authorized deputy. Standard. Clara had told Caleb that the territorial courts were backed up with the Hale case proceedings, and that the magistrate's circuit through Red Hollow wasn't scheduled until late May, which meant they were looking at 2 months of continued waiting, which was fine, which was the right kind of waiting. The kind that had a date attached to it and a clear thing on the other side. He showed the letter to Evelyn. She read it at the kitchen table as they'd read everything else. She folded it and put it on the table and looked at it for a moment. May, she said. Late May, he said. She nodded. There was nothing complicated in her expression, which he'd learned to read by now. Not all of it, not everything, but the broad shapes of it. This expression was simply, all right, this is the timeline. We work within it. I'll write to my sister, she said. He hadn't known she had a sister. He realized, sitting there, that there were still significant territories of Evelyn Hart's life that he didn't know, because they'd spent the past 4 months in the kind of sustained emergency that leaves very little room for the ordinary accumulation of personal history. He knew how she thought. He knew how she moved through a problem. He knew she slept lightly and woke early and took her coffee without anything in it, and that she read every document twice before she made a judgment about it. He knew she had been a neighbor to a dying woman and had made a promise and kept it across 1,000 miles of difficult country. He didn't know she had a sister. Is she nearby? He said. Missouri, Evelyn said. We haven't been close, but she should know. A pause. She was against me coming here. She thought it was... She stopped, slightly. She thought I was making a desperate decision. Were you? Evelyn looked at him with those gray eyes. Yes, she said, but desperation isn't the same as wrong. He thought about that for a long time after she left the room. He thought about all the desperate decisions that had been made at this table and in this house over the past months. Dell riding to Cheyenne in a day and a half, Roy going out in the dark to find Clara Finch, Evelyn sitting across from 2 men who'd broken into her kitchen and reading their forged documents slowly to find the clause she needed. None of those were calm, considered, fully resourced decisions.
All of them had worked.
He was starting to think that desperation, applied with intelligence and held steady long enough, was just another word for commitment.
The Hale case moved through April with the grinding, impersonal pace of legal proceedings, which is to say it moved both faster and slower than anyone found comfortable. Clara wrote weekly, sometimes twice weekly, letters that were dense with procedural detail and that Caleb read carefully, and Evelyn read more carefully, and Roy occasionally asked to have summarized, which Evelyn did with a precision that Clara herself would have approved of. The core facts of the case were not in dispute. The forged signature document, the rail easement clause, the break-in through the mudroom, the survey records tied to the dissolved railroad company, the affidavits from the Kemper ranch hand, the Aldersons, the Morrisons, Gus Farley, Warren Polk. It was a record of sustained predatory practice across an entire valley, documented in the specific, dated, witnessed way that made it very difficult for even Hale's lawyers to reframe. Hale's lawyers tried anyway. They argued the survey team had been independent contractors. They argued the property transfers had been voluntary. They argued the forged document had been produced by a rogue employee acting without authorization, which was the kind of argument that might have worked if Briggs hadn't already been identified as central to 3 separate incidents across 4 properties. Clara wrote in mid-April, "His legal team is competent, but they're building on ground that has nothing underneath it. Every alternate explanation they offer requires the court to disbelieve documented sworn testimony from 6 separate families. That's a difficult ask." She also wrote, in the same letter, something that Caleb read twice and then handed to Evelyn without comment. "I want to be honest with you about outcomes.
Hale will face serious consequences. The property fraud charges alone carry significant penalties, and the forgery charge is federal, given the involvement of a territorial court document. But men of his resources rarely end up where they deserve to end up. What I can tell you with confidence is that his operation in this valley is finished, the rail scheme is finished, and the properties he's acquired through documented coercion are subject to review for return. For your ranch specifically, the water rights and the easement question are settled. There is no legal mechanism remaining by which he can claim either." Evelyn read it. She folded it. She said, "That's enough." He looked at her. "It would be satisfying if he ended up where he deserves," she said. "But that's not the same as what's necessary." She set the letter on the table. "What's necessary is that it stops, that the families in this valley can work their land. That's what's necessary." Roy from the doorway said, "She's right." "You were listening again," Caleb said. "I'm always listening," Roy said without apology. "Someone has to." Maisie started her seeds in the 3rd week of April. She did this with Roy's assistance and an intensity of focus that suggested she had been planning this specific project for some time. They used the small wooden boxes that had been stacked in the equipment shed since before anyone currently on the ranch could account for. And Evelyn found packets of seed in the dry goods store in town. Sunflowers, as promised, and also tomatoes because Caleb had mentioned his mother's tomatoes once, and Maisie had apparently filed that away for future use. The boxes lived on the kitchen windowsill, in the south-facing light, and Maisie checked them every morning with the thoroughness of someone conducting a scientific study. She kept a record, this was Evelyn's suggestion, taken up with immediate enthusiasm, a small notebook in which she noted the date and any observable changes, which for the first 10 days was nothing, and which she noted faithfully anyway. "Nothing again," she reported on the 11th morning, looking at the boxes. "That's normal," Evelyn said. "Things grow underground first." Maisie looked at the boxes with the expression of someone who understood this intellectually but found it unsatisfying practically. "How do you know something's happening if you can't see it?" "You wait," Evelyn said. "And you keep the conditions right. Water, light, warmth. You do what the growing needs, and you trust the process." Maisie wrote nothing yet but conditions good in her notebook and went to school. She had started school in the Red Hollow schoolhouse in April, which had required Caleb driving her in 3 mornings a week and Roy driving her the other 2, and which had required Maisie herself to walk into a room of children who mostly knew each other and sit down at a desk that was slightly too big for her, and do this without apparent difficulty, which she accomplished by the specific strategy she applied to most challenges, going very still, observing carefully, and saying nothing until she understood the shape of things. By the end of the second week, she had made one firm friend, a girl named Lucy Alderson, which Caleb found quietly perfect given the history. The school teacher, a young woman named Miss Pratt, who had come from Pennsylvania the previous year and who was still slightly surprised every day by where she'd ended up, sent a note home after the first month that said Maisie was serious and attentive and read above her age level and had an opinion about everything, delivered with great courtesy and absolutely no flexibility. Caleb read this note at the kitchen table. "That's accurate," he said. "Yes," Evelyn agreed. "I wonder where she gets it," he said. Evelyn looked at him with those gray eyes. "The reading above age level," he said. "Clearly that's from you." "And the opinions?" she said. "That," he said, "I'm still working out. Check." The first green came up on the 14th day. Maisie saw it before anyone else because she was at the windowsill before Evelyn was out of bed, which was not easy to accomplish, but which she managed. And she came down the hall and knocked on Evelyn's door and said, through the door, in the most controlled voice a 5-year-old could produce while vibrating with excitement, "They're coming up." She had turned 5 in March. Caleb had made a cake, which had been slightly uneven and perfectly acceptable, and Evelyn had given her the notebook she used for the seed records, and Roy had given her a pocket knife that was more symbolic than practical and that she wore on her belt with great gravity. Dell had given her a book about horses. Harlan, whose ribs were fully healed, had given her a drawing he'd done of the roan horse that turned out to be genuinely good, which surprised everyone, including Harlan. It had been a birthday, a real one, with people who were there because they wanted to be. Now Maisie stood at the kitchen windowsill in her nightgown in the early morning light and looked at the small green shoots coming up from the dark soil in the boxes, and she wrote in her notebook, Day 14. They came up. Conditions were good. Evelyn stood behind her and looked at the shoots over her head. "Sunflowers or tomatoes?" she said. "Both," said Maisie with satisfaction. "Both at once." Victor Hale accepted a plea agreement on the 14th of May. Clara wrote immediately, a letter that arrived on a Wednesday, and that Caleb read standing at the gate because that was where Roy had handed it to him, and that he then carried into the kitchen and set on the table without reading aloud because he needed to read it again himself first. Hale had agreed to the forfeiture of 3 properties acquired through documented coercion. 2 of them were Alderson and Morrison land, and the return process would take several more months to complete, but it would complete. He had agreed to a substantial financial penalty. He would not serve prison time, which was the part that sat in the chest with a particular weight, because men like Hale almost never served prison time because they had enough resources to make that specific outcome unlikely, regardless of what they'd done. But the operation was over, formally, legally, permanently over. The rail scheme was dead. The holding company had been dissolved by court order. The 2 men who had entered the Thorne kitchen on the night of the blizzard had been identified and charged separately with criminal trespass and document fraud, and they, unlike Hale, did not have the kind of legal representation that made prison time unlikely. Briggs had apparently left the territory entirely. No one knew where he was. Roy said this was probably for the best, a sentiment that everyone present agreed with for slightly different reasons. Caleb finished reading the letter. He put it on the table. He sat in the kitchen in the quiet of a Wednesday afternoon, with the spring light coming through the window and the seedling boxes still on the sill. They'd been moved outside in the last week as the air warmed, and he sat with the fact of it being over. Not perfectly, not with every account settled in the way that would feel like full justice, but over. He thought about his father, who had worked this land and left it to him, and would not have been able to explain what he was leaving exactly, only that it mattered and that it was worth the cost of holding on to. He thought about the men who'd cut his fences and burned his shed and stood in a meadow between a frightened child and home, and he thought about the fact that they had not gotten what they came for, not any of them. He thought about a woman on a stagecoach platform telling him she was sorry and that she couldn't leave the child behind. He heard the back door open and Evelyn came in from the east yard with dirt on her hands and the particular expression she got when the outdoor work was going well. Not happy exactly, more satisfied. The expression of someone whose relationship with productive effort was deep and uncomplicated. She saw his face. She stopped. "Clara?" she said. He took the plea, Caleb said. It's done. She stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment. She looked at him. He looked at her. The letter was between them on the table. Then she crossed the kitchen and she sat down across from him, and she picked up the letter and she read it, all of it, without hurrying, the way she read everything. When she finished, she set it down. No prison time, she said. No. She was quiet for a moment. The Aldersons get their land back. In a few months, yes. And the Morrisons, yes. She looked at the table. He could see her working through the full accounting of it. What was won, what wasn't, where the gap lived between those two things. She did this honestly, without pretending the gap wasn't there. It's not everything, she said. No, but it's enough. Yes, he said. It's enough. She looked up at him. Outside, they could hear Maisie in the east yard, talking to Roy in the way she talked to Roy. At length, with complete confidence in his attention. The sunflower seedlings were in the ground now, in the corner of the kitchen garden that was coming back to life after years of neglect, and Maisie had staked each one with a small stick and a piece of string and had labeled them in her notebook with the date they went in the ground, as though they were patients whose recovery she was tracking. I want to tell Maisie, Evelyn said. Tell her what? That it's over, that we're not worried anymore. She paused. She knows more than we've told her. She's known all winter. Kids always do. She looked at the window. I want her to hear us say it plainly, that we're staying, that this is where we are. Caleb looked at her. She knows that. She needs to hear it said. He understood that. There was knowing and there was hearing it spoken, and for a child who had lost everything she'd known and come all this way holding someone's hand, the spoken word was not a redundancy. It was the thing that made the knowing real. We'll tell her tonight, he said. The magistrate came to Red Hollow on the 23rd of May. He was a compact man named Aldridge who had been making the territorial circuit for 11 years and who had performed somewhere in the vicinity of 300 similar proceedings and who brought to each one the same efficient gravity, which was not unkind, just professional. He arrived on a Thursday, conducted 2 other pieces of business in town, and came to the Thorn Ranch on Friday morning. The witnesses were Roy and Margaret. Roy wore his good shirt, which he owned specifically for occasions he couldn't get out of, and he stood in the main room of the house with the expression of a man attending something important, with the full intention of not showing how important he found it. Margaret wore her good dress, which she had apparently pressed the previous evening, and she stood beside Roy with her hands folded and her face in the particular arrangement it took on when she was managing strong feeling with extreme discipline. Dell and Pete and Harlan had found reasons to be in the yard. None of those reasons were very convincing, but nobody questioned them. Maisie stood between Caleb and Evelyn in her good dress, which was the dark blue one that Evelyn had made from fabric brought from the dry goods store in town, and she held both of their hands, one on each side, and she stood very straight with the gravity of someone who understood that this was a significant occasion and who had personal reasons for finding it so. Magistrate Aldridge read the necessary words. He had a good voice for it, not theatrical, just clear and measured, the right weight for what was being said. He asked the required questions. Caleb answered them. Evelyn answered them. Outside, the May morning was doing what May mornings in Wyoming do when they're in a cooperative mood. The sky was clear, and the air had that particular quality of not being cold anymore in a way that felt earned rather than given. And the east pasture was the color of new grass, which is a specific shade of green that doesn't exist in any other context. When the magistrate said what needed to be said, Maisie, who had been watching his face very seriously throughout, looked up at Evelyn and then up at Caleb and said, in a stage whisper that reached everyone in the room, including probably Dell in the yard, "Is it done?" "It's done," Caleb said. She looked from one of them to the other. She seemed to be confirming something she had already believed, which was in character. Then she went back to holding both of their hands and stood there, satisfied, and Roy made a sound that was emphatically not a sniffle, and Margaret looked at the window. The summer came in right, not perfectly. No summer came in perfectly. There was a dry stretch in July that worried everyone, and a section of the east fence that needed rebuilding, and a disagreement between Pete and Harlan that took 2 weeks and Roy's intervention to resolve.
and the tomato plants got a blight on the lower leaves that Evelyn treated by cutting the affected parts away and adjusting the watering, which worked but required attention she didn't always have to spare. The sunflowers got tall. They got very tall, exactly as promised, taller than anyone had quite prepared for, 8 feet and still going in August, their heavy yellow heads tracking the light across the day with that slow, deliberate patience that always looks like contentment. Maisie stood beside them regularly and noted their height in her notebook relative to her own, which created a record of the summer as a series of measurements in which the sunflowers were always winning. Clara Finch came to the ranch in August. She had business in the area. The Alderson land return was in its final stages and required her presence. And she came to dinner on a Thursday evening and sat at the kitchen table where so much of the work of the past year had been done, and she ate Margaret's cooking with the appreciative attention of someone who had been surviving on her own efforts in Cheyenne for too long. After dinner, when Maisie had gone to bed and Margaret had gone to her room and the ranch hands were in the bunkhouse, Clara sat with Caleb and Evelyn and a bottle of whiskey that had been brought out for the occasion. "The Alderson land transfer completes next week," she said. "Morrison the week after.
Hale's financial penalties are being collected. Slowly, because men like that are good at being slow about paying, but the process is moving." She poured a measure into her glass. "I've had 2 other clients in the past 6 months reference what happened in this valley as evidence that his operation could be stopped. One of them is building a very similar case against a different set of land speculators further south." She paused. "Your records, Evelyn's records, are being used as a template. What to document, how to document it, how to make a case that holds." Evelyn looked at her glass. "I just wrote down what happened." "That's what everyone says afterward," Clara said, "but most people don't do it. They're too frightened or too tired, or they don't believe it will matter." She looked at Evelyn steadily. "You believed it would matter." "I believed it was all we had," Evelyn said. "There's a difference." "Not as much as you'd think," Clara said. She left in the morning, the gray mare ready and the saddlebag full, and Caleb watched her ride out the way he'd watched her arrive the first time, with the same feeling of something serious having been handled by someone who knew how to handle serious things. He was grateful for her in a way he hadn't entirely known how to express, and he thought probably she understood that without it being said, which was part of what made her good at her work. "Tiet, the thing about a hard year is that it changes the shape of what comes after. Not always for the worse. Sometimes the difficulty is the thing that builds the structure, presses everything down until it finds its actual form, the form it will hold under ordinary pressure, which is the only form that lasts." Caleb had known this intellectually, the way you know things you've been told by people who've been through more than you. He knew it differently now. He knew it in the fence he and Dell rebuilt in August, post by post, the 2 of them working without needing to talk much because they'd been working together long enough that the work had its own language. He knew it in the account books, which were still tight but no longer precarious. The ranch's balance shifting from survival into something that could be called carefully stability. He knew it in the kitchen garden, which had not been maintained since his mother died, and which was now producing more than Margaret could immediately use, and which therefore produced a secondary activity of Evelyn and Maisie, and occasionally Margaret herself figuring out what to do with tomatoes in large quantities. He knew it at the kitchen table, which was the same table it had always been, the same uneven legs, the same worn surface, but which was not the same table in any way that mattered. The table was different because of what had happened at it. The house was different. He was different. Evelyn was on the porch when he came in from the south pasture one evening in early September, the light going amber and low across the top of the ridge. She was sitting in the chair she'd claimed as hers sometime around February. She hadn't announced this. She'd simply sat in it consistently until it was understood. And she had a cup of something in both hands, and she was watching the light move across the pasture the way she watched things, with full presence and without commentary. He sat down in the other chair. He'd started doing this sometime in the spring, sitting on the porch in the evenings when the work was done. Before this year, he'd rarely used the porch except as a route from the door to the yard. The ridge was going from gold to dark. The creek made its sound at the edge of the east pasture, constant and indifferent, the same sound it had been making since before anyone on this land was born and would make long after. Maisie's asleep, Evelyn said. She dropped off in the middle of telling Roy about something she'd read. He sat there until she was out and then carried her up. Roy's going soft, Caleb said. Roy's always been soft, Evelyn said. He just needed the right occasion. They sat in the quiet. The first stars were beginning, faint and tentative in the east, where the sky had gone dark first. He thought about what it had taken to get here, not just the months of this year. The legal fight, the documentation, the letters and the blizzard, and the forged document and the two men in the kitchen. All of that, yes. But also what it had taken to send the letter to the agency in St. Louis. What it had taken for Evelyn to get on a stagecoach with a child and an honest letter and go towards something she couldn't fully see. What it had taken for a 4-year-old to carry the weight of loss across 1,000 miles and still be able, on the other side of it, to plant sunflowers and keep careful records of their progress. People talked about strength as though it was a fixed thing, something you either had or you didn't. He didn't think that was right. He thought strength was more like the creek. Not a fixed quantity, but a direction. Not the absence of current, but the persistence of it. The daily decision to keep moving towards something even when the course was unclear and the banks were uncertain. The thing no one told you was that it was easier with someone beside you. Not because they carried it for you. They couldn't. Nobody could. But because knowing there was another person holding the same line made the holding possible in a way it hadn't been alone. He'd been alone a long time before this year. He hadn't known how alone until it changed. "What are you thinking about?" Evelyn said. He looked at her. In the evening light, her face had that quality it sometimes had, settled, present, not asking him to be anything other than what he was. "About what it cost," he said, "to get here." She was quiet for a moment. "Was it worth it?" He looked out at the pasture, at the ridge, at the sky filling up with stars. "Yes," he said. She leaned her head back against the chair and looked at the same sky. "I've been thinking about Maisie's notebook," she said after a while. "The seed records? She started it because I told her to, but she kept it because it meant something to her." Evelyn looked at the stars. All those mornings she wrote nothing yet, conditions good. She didn't stop because nothing was happening. She just kept doing the work and trusting the process. Caleb looked at her. "I think about that," Evelyn said. "When things are hard, when the progress is underground and you can't see it yet, just keep the conditions right. Do the work. Trust that something's growing." He didn't say anything. Some things you just let sit, the way you let the true things sit, without covering them with words that would only make them smaller. The night settled around the porch. Inside, the house made its sounds. The tick of the stove cooling, the settle of floorboards, the faint creak of the old house doing what old houses do. Somewhere above them, Maisie slept in the room that was hers now in every way that mattered, in the bed that fit her now because they'd traded the old one in May, with the notebook on the bedside table and the drawing of the roan horse on the wall and the small pocket knife on the dresser that she wore with great gravity and had not yet found an occasion to use. She had come here with nothing except a woman's promise and a willingness to hold on. And what she had now was this: a room, a bed, a school, a friend named Lucy, a horse that knew to expect her at the gate, an old man who listened to everything she said with the attention of someone in an important meeting, a kitchen table that was the center of the world, a garden that was teaching her that growth happens underground first, and two people who had chosen, not accidentally, not by default, but by a series of daily decisions made in difficulty, to be her family. There is a kind of family you are born into, which you do not choose, and which shapes you in ways you spend your whole life understanding. And there is another kind, the kind built out of need and decision and the specific courage of people who choose each other in hard circumstances and hold on. That second kind has a different quality to it. Not better, not worse, but more deliberate, more visible. You can see the seams of it, see where the choices were made, see what it cost. That visibility is not a weakness, it is the proof. The stars were full across the Wyoming sky by the time they went inside. The porch chairs sat empty in the dark, the way chairs sit when the people who use them have gone to something warmer. The east pasture lay quiet under the night, the creek running its patient course along the edge of it, the underground water sitting still and deep below the surface, belonging to no one who had tried to take it, going nowhere except where it had always gone. In the morning, Maisie would check her notebook. She would go to the garden, and the sunflowers would be there, tall and extravagant and slightly ridiculous in their height, exactly as promised, tracking the light. She would write the date. She would write what she saw. She would keep the record.